I used to believe the quietest places were the safest. Maybe that's why I kept returning to forgotten roads where the trees leaned close enough to hide the sky. There was something comforting about those lonely drives after sunset, when the last farmhouse light faded behind me, and even the radio seemed to give up trying to reach that part of the world. The forest always felt older than memory. Every branch carried the weight of stories that no one wanted to repeat, and every slow breeze sounded as though someone far away had whispered my name before changing their mind. My father used to tell me that villages disappear twice, first from maps and then from people's memories. I laughed when I was young, but years later I found myself following a narrow dirt road that wasn't marked on any sign. The smell of damp pine drifted through my open window, mixing with the fading warmth of the day's sun. A single church bell echoed somewhere beyond the hills, though there wasn't another building in sight. As darkness settled between the trees, I noticed tiny lights moving in the distance. They weren't lanterns. They weren't fireflies. They seemed to wait for me. I should have turned around then. Instead, I stopped the car and stepped into the silence, convinced that someone might need help. That's when I saw the first house, late in October, just before the first snow reached the higher peaks. I found myself climbing a narrow mountain road that barely deserved to be called a road at all. The afternoon light had already begun to fade behind the tall ridges, leaving the valley below wrapped in a pale gray glow. Pine trees lined both sides of the path, their branches moving with a gentle rustling that reminded me of old paper being turned one page at a time. I had been driving for hours without seeing another car. That never bothered me much. My father used to say the quiet roads were the honest ones. They never promised company, only distance. I remembered those words as I rounded one final bend, watching small stones roll away beneath my tires before settling into the grass. The village appeared without warning. It rested against a mountainside, as though it had been waiting there for centuries. Small wooden homes stood in neat rows. Thin lines of smoke drifted from several chimneys. Laundry hung between porches, moving gently in the cool breeze. Everything looked lived in. Everything looked ordinary. Yet the dusty road before me held no footprints. Not one. I stepped from the car and closed the door with more care than usual. The ground felt firm beneath my boots, dry despite the cold season. A faint smell of dried flowers floated through the air, sweet enough to remind me of the old books my grandmother kept inside a cedar chest. I hadn't thought about that memory in years. The village answered my arrival with almost complete silence. No barking dogs. No children laughing, only the distant call of a single bird somewhere beyond the rooftops. As I walked farther in, I noticed curtains shifting behind windows. Someone was watching. A few moments later, a man stepped onto his porch carrying a basket of firewood. He smiled politely, nodded once, and continued stacking the wood without asking where I had come from. Others greeted me the same way. A woman sweeping her steps paused long enough to offer a warm smile. An old farmer lifted 2 fingers from the brim of his hat. A young boy looked at me with quiet curiosity before disappearing into his home. None of them seemed surprised that a stranger had arrived. It felt less like they were meeting me and more like they had expected me. The smell of fresh bread drifted from one open doorway while somewhere nearby water began to boil. A kettle gave a long whistle that echoed softly between the houses. I followed the sound without thinking. The front door stood open. Inside, a cast iron kettle rested above a small stove. Steam filled the tiny kitchen. A loaf of bread cooled on the table beside neatly folded cloth napkins. No one was there. I waited for several moments, listening for soft footsteps from another room. Nothing came. The whistle stopped on its own. The room became so quiet that I could hear my own breath settling into an even rhythm. I quietly backed away and pulled the door almost shut behind me, unsure whether I had interrupted someone's afternoon or wandered into a place that no longer belonged to anyone at all. Outside, the village continued as though nothing strange had happened. The sky deepened toward evening. Golden light slipped across the windows before fading into blue. People finished carrying water. They gathered laundry. They stacked firewood. Every task seemed gentle. Every movement seemed measured. Then, almost without anyone speaking, they all began returning indoors, one after another, as though following a rule that no visitor had been told. I checked my watch. It was only a little after sunset. An elderly woman stood beside a low wooden fence wrapped in a thick gray shawl. Her silver hair caught the last bit of fading light. She watched me for a long moment before raising one hand, inviting me closer. Her eyes were kind, tired, the kind of eyes that had seen enough years to stop fearing most things. "You've come a long way," she said softly. I nodded. "I suppose I have." She looked past me toward the mountain, rising behind the village. The highest hill overlooked every rooftop, covered in dark trees that hid its summit. "Whatever you hear tonight," she whispered, "do not look toward the hill after midnight." She spoke those words as naturally as someone giving directions to the nearest well. I waited for an explanation. None came. Instead, she reached into her pocket and placed a small bundle of dried lavender into my hand. "For peaceful dreams," she said. The scent was gentle, almost comforting. Before I could thank her, she turned and disappeared inside her home, closing the door with quiet care. Evening settled quickly after that. The first stars appeared above the mountains, while a thin layer of fog gathered near the fields beyond the last row of houses. Warm light glowed from nearly every window. Somewhere in the distance, a loose shutter tapped once against its frame. I stood alone in the middle of the empty road, looking from house to house. There were still no footprints, not even the ones I should have left behind. I glanced down again. The dust stretched across the road untouched, smooth as if no one had walked there for years. A chill crept across my hands despite my coat. Then, without warning, every window in the village went dark. Every curtain was drawn. Every latch clicked into place. Every home closed itself at the exact same moment. No voices followed. No explanation came. Only the quiet feeling that something beyond the hill had finally noticed the night had begun. The farmhouse stood at the edge of the village where the road dissolved into tall grass and scattered fence posts. Morning had arrived without much color. A blanket of pale clouds covered the mountains, softening every outline until the world seemed painted in faded shades of gray. The air carried the quiet scent of old candle wax mixed with fresh cedar from the porch beams. It was a simple smell, but it reminded me of the tiny church my mother used to visit on winter mornings, where melted candles gathered along the windowsills like frozen rivers. After the strange silence of the night before, I expected the village to feel different. Instead, everything looked almost peaceful. A few villagers swept their porches. Someone carried a basket of vegetables across the lane. An old dog slept beneath a wooden cart, lifting one ear whenever a breeze wandered through the street. No one mentioned the way every window had closed together. No one asked if I had slept well. It was as though the night belonged to another world that everyone had quietly agreed to forget. I wandered without much direction, following narrow paths between gardens where fading autumn flowers leaned against weathered fences. My boots brushed across fallen leaves, their dry edges breaking softly beneath each step. Above me, sparrows crossed the sky in uneven lines before disappearing into the trees beyond the village. That was when I noticed the farmhouse. It stood alone on a gentle rise, separated from the nearest house by an open field. Its porch wrapped around the front like welcoming arms. Every board showed years of wind and rain, yet nothing appeared neglected. A rocking chair rested near the door, moving just enough to suggest someone had stood only moments before. Hanging beside the entrance was a small brass lantern. Its flame glowed with a quiet amber light. I climbed the porch steps and paused. The front door was slightly open. "Hello," I called, my voice careful enough that it almost felt impolite. Only the distant ticking of an unseen clock answered. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of polished wood and candle wax that had long ago soaked into the walls. Dust floated through thin beams of daylight, turning lazily as though time itself moved more slowly inside the house. Everything waited exactly where it belonged. A pair of reading glasses rested beside an empty teacup. A knitted blanket lay folded across a chair. Near the fireplace stood a narrow writing desk with a single leather journal resting neatly on its surface. Something about it drew my attention before I could explain why. I reached for the journal and hesitated. My father had always believed diaries should remain closed unless their owner invited you to read them. He treated old letters the same way. Every page belongs to someone's heart. he would say. I smiled at the memory before convincing myself that perhaps this book had been left here for a reason. The leather felt smooth beneath my fingers. When I opened it, the first pages contained ordinary notes. Weather, harvests, small repairs around the property. Then the handwriting changed. The lines became slower, more careful. One sentence stopped me completely. He will arrive before the first snow. He will stand on the porch and wonder why the lantern is already lit. I stared at the words. The first snow had not yet come, and only moments earlier I had wondered exactly that. A cold feeling settled quietly inside my chest. I turned another page. The journal described small thoughts that sounded strangely familiar. It mentioned someone who counted mountain turns while driving lonely roads because it helped keep sleep away. I had done that for years. Another page spoke of someone who always smelled cedar before remembering childhood. I had thought about my mother's church only minutes before entering the farmhouse. Each page felt less like a stranger's memory, more like my own. I searched for a date. The ink had faded, but the year remained clear. It had been written decades before I was born. I closed the journal and stepped back from the desk. The room seemed unchanged. Yet I could no longer shake the feeling that I had interrupted a conversation already waiting for me. Needing fresh air, I walked outside. The lantern beside the porch still burned. Its light looked almost unnecessary beneath the pale afternoon sky. I descended the steps and crossed halfway through the yard. Something made me glance back. The flame had gone out. I frowned. Perhaps the wind had caught it. I took another few steps toward the road. Behind me, the lantern quietly came alive again. Its warm glow returned without anyone touching it. I watched for several long moments. No movement, no sound, only the steady light swaying gently beneath its metal frame. Curiosity pulled me back to the porch. As soon as my foot touched the first step, the lantern faded once more until only a thin trail of smoke drifted upward. I tested it again, away from the house. The light returned. Toward the house, it disappeared. The pattern never changed. By late afternoon, I had stopped trying to explain it. Some questions seemed to grow larger each time I reached for an answer. The mountains darkened as evening approached. One by one, distant windows across the village caught the fading light of sunset. I slipped the journal back onto the desk, exactly where I had found it. The pages settled with a quiet sigh. As I turned to leave, I rested my hand on the doorknob. That was when I heard it. A gentle knock, not from the front door, not from behind me, from beneath the porch floor. 3 slow taps. Then nothing. The road out of the village curved through a stand of old pines before joining a narrow highway that followed the mountains. I left shortly after sunrise, hoping a little distance might clear my thoughts. The strange farmhouse stayed behind me, along with its lantern and the journal that seemed to know me better than I knew myself. The morning was cool. A thin layer of mist rested over the fields, and the sky carried the pale blue color that appears just before autumn fully settles in. I rolled down the window for fresh air. The scent of damp leaves drifted inside, followed by the faint smell with smoke from distant cabins. For nearly an hour, I saw no one. Then, around a gentle bend in the road, a small diner appeared. Its sign read, Hollow Creek Diner. The paint had faded with age, but the windows were clean and a row of old pickup trucks stood neatly outside. They looked as though they had been parked there for years without collecting much dust. My stomach reminded me that I had skipped breakfast. Inside, the diner felt warm enough to chase away the mountain chill. A coffee pot rested behind the counter, sending gentle curls of steam toward the ceiling. Fresh biscuits cooled beneath a cloth towel. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pan gave a quiet hiss before falling silent again. The room smelled of roasted coffee, warm butter, and toasted bread. It should have felt comforting. Instead, something about the place seemed carefully arranged, as though every chair had been placed with unusual care. 5 customers sat at different tables. One studied a folded newspaper. Another looked out the window. An elderly couple shared a pie that neither of them appeared to eat. No one spoke. A waitress greeted me with a soft smile. You've taken longer than I expected. I paused before answering. I'm sorry. She blinked once, then smiled again. Please, Sit wherever you like. Perhaps I had misheard her. I chose a booth beside the front window, where I could watch the quiet road stretching back toward the mountains. The vinyl seat creaked gently beneath me. Someone had carved tiny initials into the edge of the table many years before. The waitress poured a cup of coffee without asking. Its rich aroma filled the air between us. I thanked her and took a careful sip. The flavor surprised me. It wasn't unpleasant, just unusually bitter. Not the bitterness of burnt beans. Something deeper, like the taste of an old memory that refused to fade. I added cream, then sugar. Neither changed it very much. You'll get used to it, the waitress said as she wiped the neighboring table. I looked up. I didn't say anything. No, she replied quietly. Not yet. Before I could ask what she meant, she walked away to greet a customer who had entered without making the bell above the door ring. Breakfast arrived a few minutes later. Eggs, toast, a small bowl of fruit. Everything looked fresh, yet the room remained strangely quiet. Even the forks touching the plates made almost no sound. The only steady noise came from an old clock hanging above the counter. Tick, tick, tick. I glanced toward it. The hands pointed to 6:17. I smiled to myself. My grandfather had owned a clock that often stopped for days before starting again without warning. I wondered if this one had the same stubborn habit. When I finished eating, I noticed something odd. The newspaper on the nearby table had not changed pages. The elderly couple still held their forks exactly where they had been. The man by the window had not shifted in his seat. Only the waitress continued moving naturally, filling cups and straightening napkins. She returned with the coffee pot. Another refill? I hesitated. I think I'm all right. You said yes last time. The words settled between us. I've never been here before. She tilted her head slightly, studying my face with quiet patience. You haven't? There was no challenge in her voice, only genuine surprise. She set the pot down. Then perhaps I'm remembering tomorrow. A nervous laugh escaped before I could stop it. She didn't laugh with me. Instead, she reached into her apron and removed a folded receipt. This belongs to you. I unfolded the paper. Across the bottom, beneath a list of meals, someone had written in careful handwriting, "Don't ask about the clock." I looked up immediately. Who wrote this? The waitress frowned. Wrote what? I turned the receipt toward her. The message had vanished. Only the total remained. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the mountains, dimming the daylight for a moment. The diner felt cooler than before. I rubbed my hands together, trying to shake away the uneasy feeling growing inside me. My eyes returned to the clock. Still 6:17. I checked my watch. Nearly 9 o'clock. I watched the second hand on my wrist move steadily forward. The clock above the counter never moved at all. When I finally stood to leave, the waitress walked me to the register. "Safe travels," she said. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "We'll finish our conversation next visit. I don't think I'll be back." She offered the same quiet smile. "That's what you told me before." I stepped outside into the cool mountain air. The breeze brushed gently across my face, carrying away the smell of coffee and warm bread. My car waited exactly where I had left it. I opened the door. Something urged me to glance back through the diner's front window. Every customer remained exactly as they had been. The man still held his newspaper. The elderly couple still sat with untouched pie. The woman near the window still looked toward the mountains. No one blinked. No one moved. Even the waitress stood perfectly still behind the counter, her eyes resting on the place where I had been sitting only moments before. Then the curtain near the door drifted softly across the glass. When it settled again, I could no longer tell whether anyone had been inside at all. The road back toward the village felt shorter than I remembered. By the time the afternoon sun settled behind a layer of pale clouds, I had stopped trying to convince myself that the diner had been ordinary. Some places seemed content to exist without explaining themselves. The village welcomed me with the same quiet rhythm. Smoke rose from chimneys. Doors stood open. Someone hummed a tune I couldn't quite recognize before it faded into the breeze. I decided not to think about the waitress or the clock that refused to move. Instead, I wandered beyond the last row of houses, Following a narrow path that climbed gently along the hillside, the trail led me to an old orchard. Apple trees stretched across the slope in careful rows, their branches heavy with fruit. Some apples glowed a deep red, while others carried soft shades of gold. Fallen leaves covered the ground like a worn blanket, their edges dry enough to crumble beneath each step. The place should have been full of life. Instead, it felt as though it had been waiting, not abandoned, not forgotten, simply waiting. A wooden fence surrounded the orchard, though several sections had leaned over with age. Moss covered the lower rails, and vines climbed slowly around the posts. Near the entrance stood a faded sign with lettering almost erased by years of rain. I could make out only one word: welcome. A cool breeze wandered through the branches. The leaves trembled. The air itself remained calm. I stopped walking. The movement didn't make sense. Nothing brushed against my face. The grass around my boots stayed perfectly still. Yet every apple tree swayed gently from side to side, as though answering a wind that touched only them. I watched for several moments. The motion never spread beyond the orchard. It ended exactly at the fence. The scent of fresh apples drifted toward me. Sweet, bright, almost enough to make me forget everything else. Then another smell followed beneath it. Not strong, only a faint trace of burning wood. It reminded me of evenings from childhood when my father would light the fireplace before the first winter storm arrived. I could almost hear the soft crackle of old logs settling into glowing embers while he read quietly beside the window. The memory brought an unexpected comfort. For a little while, I simply stood there breathing the familiar scent. Then I noticed a swing. It hung from a broad branch of the oldest tree near the center of the orchard. Thick ropes held a weathered wooden seat polished smooth by countless years of use. The swing moved gently. Forward, back, forward, back. It made no sound at all. No creak. No whisper of rope against bark. Only motion. I found myself walking toward it before realizing I had made the choice. The grass beneath the trees felt unusually soft. Fallen apples rested untouched where they had landed, each one perfect despite lying on the ground. Bees wandered lazily between late blossoms without paying any attention to me. The swing continued its quiet rhythm. When I reached it, it slowed until it became completely still. I rested one hand against the smooth wood. It was warmer than I expected, as though someone had been sitting there only moments before. I looked around. No one. Only rows of silent trees disappearing deeper into the orchard. A low branch nearby held a single apple unlike the others. It was larger than the rest, its skin shining softly where sunlight slipped through the leaves. Without thinking, I reached toward it. My fingers stopped only inches away. My father's voice returned as clearly as if he stood beside me. Never take fruit from forgotten land. I had laughed when he first told me that. I was 12, curious about every abandoned farm we passed during long summer drives. He never explained why. He simply repeated the warning whenever we found old orchards hidden beyond broken fences. At the time, it sounded like one more family superstition. Standing there now, I wasn't so sure. I lowered my hand. The apple remained on its branch, untouched. The moment I stepped back, a single leaf drifted gently to the ground between us. Then came a voice. So you remembered. It was little more than a whisper, quiet enough that I couldn't tell whether I had truly heard it or only imagined it. I turned slowly. No one stood behind me. The rows of trees remained empty. The swing had begun moving again, forward, back, without a sound. The warm scent of apples slowly faded, leaving only the faint trace of smoke from somewhere beyond the hill. The light around me seemed softer now, as though evening had arrived without my noticing. Long shadows stretched across the orchard floor, reaching toward the path that led back to the village. I took one last look at the untouched apple. For just an instant, it seemed almost to gnaw beneath its branch. Then the breeze returned. This time it moved through the entire hillside. Leaves whispered together overhead. The orchard swayed as one. As I reached the old wooden gate, another quiet breath of words followed me across the fading afternoon. Thank you. I didn't turn around. The chapel stood on the highest rise above the village, where the last cottages gave way to open ground and scattered stones. I began to walk just after noon. The clouds had settled low over the mountains, turning the sunlight into a soft gray glow that reached every corner without casting sharp edges. A cool breeze carried the clean scent of mountain grass, while tiny white flowers nodded along the narrow path. From below, the chapel looked small. The farther I climbed, the older it seemed. Its walls were built from rough blocks of pale stone that had weathered countless winters. Moss filled the narrow spaces between them, and ivy climbed around the arched windows without covering the glass. The wooden door bore no lock, only a smooth iron handle polished by many hands. I rested my palm against it. The wood felt cool. When I pushed gently, the hinges opened with barely a sound. Inside, the chapel welcomed me with quiet light. Tall windows softened the afternoon into long bands that stretched across the floor. Rows of simple benches faced a modest altar dressed with fresh white cloth. Someone had placed a small vase of mountain flowers beside a single candle that had already burned halfway down. The place smelled of clean linen and old cedar beams warmed by many summers. I expected the stone floor to feel cold beneath my steps. Instead, a gentle warmth rose through the soles of my boots. I paused. Outside, the day carried the chill of late autumn. Inside, the walls held a warmth that should not have been there. I knelt beside one of the benches and rested my hand against the stone. It was almost comforting. Not hot, simply warmer than the sunlight beyond the windows. For reasons I couldn't explain, the feeling eased a tightness that had been growing inside me since my arrival in the village. My grandmother used to believe old places remembered kindness. Whenever we visited small country churches, she would touch the walls before leaving, thanking them for every prayer they had quietly carried. As a child, I copied the habit without understanding it. Now, years later, I found myself doing the same thing. The memory brought a faint smile. It disappeared as another set of footsteps entered the chapel. An elderly priest approached from a side doorway. His dark robe brushed softly against the floor, and silver hair framed a face marked by gentle lines rather than age alone. He offered a welcoming nod before taking a seat near the front. "You found our little chapel," he said. "I wasn't sure anyone would be here. Someone usually is." His answer settled into room without asking for more. For a while, neither of us spoke. The quiet felt natural. Outside, a few leaves drifted across the windows before disappearing from view. My eyes wandered upward. High above the entrance hung a single bronze bell rope, disappearing into the tower overhead. "I haven't heard it ring," I said. The priest followed my gaze. "It does not ring often." "What makes it ring?" He folded his hands together. "It rings when someone is remembered." I waited for him to smile. He didn't. "I don't think I understand." "Most people don't." His voice remained calm, almost thoughtful. "Names disappear more easily than we imagine. Memories become smaller with each passing year. But every so often, someone is remembered with enough love that the bell answers. The words linger between us." I wanted to ask who had built the chapel, how old the bell was, why the village seemed wrapped in quiet secrets. Instead, I asked the simplest question: who was remembered last? The priest lowered his eyes. For the first time since we met, he seemed uncertain. "I cannot say." "Because you don't know?" He looked toward the nearest window, where gray clouds drifted slowly across the mountain. "Because no one tells that story." The afternoon passed gently. A few villagers entered one by one, lighting candles before taking silent seats. No one spoke above a whisper. Some closed their eyes in prayer. Others simply sat, watching the light change across the floor. As the hours slipped by, the gray sky deepened toward evening. Without anyone giving instructions, every person in the chapel quietly stood. The priest walked to the front. No sermon followed. No hymn, only silence. Then, from high above us, the bell rang. Once, the single note rolled through the valley like a slow breath. It was neither loud nor sharp. It carried a strange kindness, fading across the hills until only the memory of its sound remained. Every villager lowered their head. Some closed their eyes. One elderly man quietly wiped a tear from his cheek. No one spoke a name. No one explained why the bell had answered. When the last echo disappeared, the priest whispered a brief prayer that I could not quite hear. The people began leaving as quietly as they had arrived. Outside, the evening air had grown cooler. The first stars appeared between breaks in the clouds, and lanterns flickered to life across the village below. I walked beside the priest as far as the chapel gate. The bell, I began. He nodded. Yes. Who was remembered today? He remained silent for several long moments. Finally, he looked toward the distant rooftops. I have lived here for 43 years, he said softly. Each time the bell rings, I ask myself the same question. He offered a tired smile. And each time, no one is willing to answer. With that, he turned back toward the chapel. The wooden door drifted shut behind him with quiet care, leaving me alone on the hill beneath the gathering night, wondering whose memory had become strong enough to wake a bell that no one dared to explain. Rain began sometime before dawn. I woke to the soft tapping of drops against the roof of the guest room where the villagers had offered me a place to stay. The sound was steady, almost comforting, the kind of rain that seemed content to fall without hurry. When I opened the window, cool air drifted inside, carrying the sharp scent of motor oil from my car parked below the hill. It mingled with the clean smell of fresh rain until the two became strangely difficult to separate. For a moment, everything felt ordinary. The strange bell, the silent orchard, the empty farmhouse. They seemed farther away in the gray morning light. I decided it was time to leave. The villagers greeted me with the same quiet kindness as I carried my bag to the car. An old man repairing a fence lifted his hand in farewell. A young woman sweeping her porch smiled as though she already knew how my day would end. No one asked where I was going. No one offered directions. The engine started on the second try. I turned onto the narrow road that wound between the mountains, watching the village disappear behind the rain-speckled windshield. A small part of me expected relief to follow. Instead, I felt oddly reluctant. It was a feeling you get after leaving someone's home before a conversation has truly finished. The road bent gently through the forest. Tall pines lined both sides, their trunks disappearing into gray distance. Water gathered in shallow ditches, and small streams crossed beneath weathered bridges. After 20 minutes, I rounded a familiar corner. A wooden bridge stretched across a narrow creek. I frowned. I was almost certain I had crossed it before entering the village. Perhaps there had been another one. Mountain roads often looked alike. I drove across without giving it much thought. Another 20 minutes passed. The rain eased. Clouds lifted just enough to reveal the peaks beyond the trees. Then the road curved once more. The same bridge stood waiting. This time I slowed the car. The railing on the left side held a broken plank shaped like a crooked letter L. I remembered noticing it earlier. The creek below carried a fallen log caught between two rocks. It was the same bridge. I pulled over. The engine idled quietly while I studied the map folded across the passenger seat. The road should have continued south toward the nearest town. There were no loops, no circles, no reason to return here. I laughed softly to myself. "You missed a turn," I said aloud. Hearing my own voice made the explanation feel more believable. I crossed the bridge again. A little farther ahead, a weathered road sign appeared where I didn't remember seeing one before. The arrow pointed left. Valley Pass. That sounded familiar. I turned. The road narrowed until branches brushed lightly against the sides of the car. Rainwater dripped from the trees in slow, steady drops. 10 minutes later, the bridge appeared again. This time the road sign stood on the opposite side. The arrow pointed right. I stepped out into the cool morning air. Rain clung to my jacket. The creek murmured beneath the bridge, exactly as before. I walked to the sign. The wood looked old, very old, yet the arrow itself seemed freshly painted. I reached out and touched it. The paint was dry. Behind me came the quiet sound of my car. The engine had stalled. I hurried back and turned the key. Nothing, only a tire clicking beneath the hood. I tried again. The engine caught for a heartbeat before falling silent once more. The smell of motor oil grew stronger, not overwhelming, just enough to make me think something had begun to leak. I climbed out again, opened the hood, and stared at an engine I knew very little about. Everything looked normal. No smoke, no loose wires, no obvious problem. When I returned to the driver's seat, the car started immediately, as though nothing had happened. By early afternoon, I had crossed the bridge 6 times, or perhaps 7. I wasn't entirely sure anymore. The rain had stopped. The clouds had begun to break apart. Yet every road folded gently back toward the same wooden crossing. Even the trees seemed familiar now. One tall pine leaned slightly over the road, like an old man listening to a secret. A large boulder rested beside the ditch with a streak of white running through its center. I passed them again, and again. My watch insisted that only 2 hours had passed. It felt much longer. I stopped counting the turns, stopped checking the map. Each attempt ended where the last one had, at the bridge. Late in the afternoon, I noticed something new. Far beyond the railing, where the road disappeared between the trees, stood a person, too distant to recognize, too still to ignore. The figure wore a dark coat that reached almost the knees. One arm lifted slowly, a quiet wave, not hurried, not inviting, simply acknowledging that I was there. Relief washed over me. Another traveler. At last, I called out. My voice echoed softly between the trees. The figure did not answer. Instead, it lowered its arm, turned, and walked into forest. Not quickly, not slowly, just enough that within a few moments only the empty road remained. I hurried back into the car and drove forward, hoping to catch up. The bend ahead came into view, then the creek, then the weathered railing with its broken plank. The wooden bridge waited in silence. There was no sign of the stranger, only the uneasy feeling that whoever had waved at me had known, long before I did, that every road I chose would bring me back to the same place. The next morning arrived without rain. A pale sky stretched above the mountains, and the first light settled softly across the rooftops of the village. Everything looked washed clean after yesterday's storm. Water clung to fence posts, and tiny drops rested on spiderwebs that hung between the wild grasses. The quiet should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt as though the village had been listening all night. I stood outside the guest house with a cup of warm tea, watching thin trails of smoke rise from chimneys. The road that had refused to let me leave looked perfectly ordinary from here. No one mentioned the strange bridge. No one asked why I had returned. Perhaps they already knew. Or perhaps everyone who came here eventually stopped trying to leave. As I finished my tea, I noticed an old grain mill standing near the edge of the village where a narrow stream curved between 2 hills. Its large wooden wheel rested above the water. It wasn't moving. The stream flowed beneath it with enough strength to turn it easily, yet the wheel remained perfectly still. Curiosity led me down the narrow path. The mill had probably been built generations ago. Weathered beams supported a steep roof covered with dark moss. One window stood open just enough for the morning breeze to wander inside. The scent of old cloth drifted from the doorway, mixed with the dry smell of grain that had long ago settled into every crack of the wood. I stepped inside. Dust floated lazily through thin shafts of light that slipped between the boards. Empty sacks leaned against one wall. A broken shovel rested beside a stack of wooden barrels. Everything looked untouched for years, yet nothing felt abandoned. The floor gave a gentle creak beneath my weight. I stopped walking. The sound echoed through the empty room, followed by something else. Voices, very quiet, too soft to understand. At first I thought they came from outside. I listened carefully. No, they were beneath me. Faint conversations drifted upward to floorboards, as though several people stood in a room below, speaking just quietly enough to keep their words hidden. I knelt and placed one hand against the worn planks. The wood felt cool. The voices continued. One voice sounded old. Another belonged to someone much younger. They overlapped gently, never growing louder, never becoming clear enough to understand. It reminded me of sitting downstairs while my parents spoke with neighbors late into the evening. As a child, I could always hear the rhythm of their conversation without making out the words. Somehow, that memory should have comforted me. It didn't. I searched the room for a cellar door. There wasn't one. No staircase. No hatch. Nothing that suggested another level existed beneath the mill. The whispers continued anyway. I stepped outside, and looked around the building. An elderly man was repairing a fence not far away. He noticed me watching the mill and offered a polite nod. "Does anyone use this place?" I asked. He hammered another nail before answering. "Not anymore. I think I heard people inside." "I know." His reply was so calm that I wondered if I had misunderstood. "You know?" He nodded once. "Everyone hears them." I waited for him to explain. Instead, he returned to his work. "Aren't you curious who's down there?" He paused only long enough to glance toward the mill. "No." "Why not?" "Because they never ask us to come." That was all he said. A few minutes later, two women carrying baskets walked past the mill. Neither looked toward it. A young boy skipped along the path behind them, humming softly to himself. As he reached the building, he stopped humming. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. Only after passing the mill did the tune quietly return. No one acknowledged the voices. No one seemed frightened by them. Their silence unsettled me far more than the whispers themselves. By afternoon, I found myself back inside the mill. The conversations were still there, unchanged, like an old radio playing somewhere beyond the walls. I walked slowly across the room, listening for any place where the sound grew stronger. Near the center of the floor, it did. The voices almost formed words. Almost. I leaned closer. One voice seemed to laugh. Another answered with what might have been my name. A chill moved gently across my shoulders. Without thinking, I spoke aloud. "Who's there?" The words left my mouth and settled into the quiet air. The conversations ended. Not gradually. Not one voice after another. Every whisper stopped at the exact same moment. The mill became completely still. No breeze entered through the window. No bird sang outside. Even the stream beyond the wall seemed strangely distant. I remained frozen where I stood, listening with all the patience I could gather. Nothing answered. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. After several long moments, I stepped backward toward the doorway. The old floor creaked beneath my boot. Still nothing. When I finally reached the sunlight outside, I looked back through the open window. The dust continued drifting through the light exactly as before. The sacks hadn't moved. The barrels remained where they had always been. The mill looked harmless. Yet I could not shake the feeling that the voices had not disappeared at all. They had simply stopped speaking because they realized I could hear them. Morning arrived with a clear sky. For the first time since I had entered the valley, sunlight spread gently across the rooftops, warming the wooden fences and narrow lanes until the village looked almost cheerful. From my window, I could see smoke rising from breakfast fires, and somewhere nearby, a rooster announced the day with more confidence than accuracy. I wished I could borrow that confidence. The grain mill had stayed with me through the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered the whispers ending all at once, as if an unseen room full of people had turned to look in my direction. After breakfast, I decided to walk somewhere brighter. The eastern edge of the village opened into a small meadow where wildflowers still clung to the last weeks of autumn. Beyond it stood a one-room schoolhouse with white walls and a red roof faded by years of mountain weather. Children's laughter should have belonged there. Instead, the building waited in complete quiet. The front steps were neatly swept. The windows had been washed. A tiny bell hung above the entrance, though it never moved. Someone cared for the place. Someone who was never there. The door opened with little effort. Inside, sunlight rested across rows of small wooden desks. Each one held a slate, a piece of chalk, and a well-used reader. Coats hung from pegs along the back wall, brushed clean as though they had been placed there only yesterday. The room smelled of polished wood and old paper. It reminded me of my first classroom. I could almost picture my teacher writing carefully across the blackboard while I struggled to keep my letters straight. She always smiled when I erased a mistake instead of hiding it. "A clean start is never something to be ashamed of," she used to say. I hadn't thought about her in years. Dust floated gently through the sunlight. Nothing else moved. I walked slowly between the desks, running my fingers across smooth wooden tops worn soft by countless small hands. One notebook lay open near the front of the room. Every page was blank. The chalkboard stood clean. I smiled to myself. Perhaps the village simply kept old places alive out of respect. Then I noticed a piece of white chalk resting in the tray beneath the board. It rolled, only a few inches, then stopped. I stared at it. No breeze entered through the windows. The room remained perfectly calm. A faint scratching reached my ears. I looked up. The chalk lifted. Not quickly, not with any force. It rose just enough to touch the blackboard. One careful line appeared. Then another. The sound was soft, slow, as though an invisible hand wrote with patient care. I didn't move. The sentence grew one letter at a time. When the chalk finally settled back into the tray, I stepped closer. My heart sank. The lesson written across the board wasn't a lesson at all. It was a memory. It described the small country school I had attended as a child. It mentioned the cracked window near my desk, the apple tree outside the playground, even my teacher's words. A clean start is never something to be ashamed of. I reached toward the writing. My fingertips hovered just above the chalk. There was no possible way anyone here could have known those things. I wiped the board clean with the eraser resting beside it. White dust drifted gently downward. The board was empty again. I took a slow breath. Perhaps I was tired. Perhaps my mind had begun connecting ordinary things into impossible patterns. That explanation lasted only a moment. Behind me came the same soft scratching. I turned. The chalk had risen again. This time it moved faster. Sentence after sentence appeared. Not about my childhood. About yesterday. The bridge. The farmhouse. The orchard. The words formed events exactly as I remembered them. The final line stopped halfway through. Tomorrow you will... The chalk fell. The room became quiet once more. I waited. Nothing else appeared. A strange uneasiness settled inside me. The unfinished sentence felt heavier than any complete warning. I wandered toward the windows, hoping fresh air might clear my thoughts. Outside, the meadow stretched peacefully beneath the afternoon sun. Not a single villager walked past. The entire hillside seemed to be holding its breath. When I turned back toward the classroom, something had changed. The last desk in the final row now stood several inches farther from the others. I frowned. Surely I would have noticed that before. I walked to the back of the room. The desk was old, its surface covered with tiny scratches left by restless students. Someone had carved a small bird into one corner many years ago. I rested my hand on it. The wood was warm. Very gently, the desk moved. Not far, only the width of my hand. It slid backward across the floor, without making a sound. I stepped away. The chair behind it remained exactly where it belonged. Only the desk had moved. The room seemed larger now, as though space itself had quietly shifted. A cool breeze entered through the open doorway, carrying the scent of dry grass from a meadow. I realized I was no longer alone. Not because I heard anyone, not because I saw anyone, but because the classroom no longer felt empty. I backed toward the entrance without taking my eyes off the last row. Nothing moved again. The chalk rested quietly beneath the board. The desks remained perfectly arranged, except for one. When I reached the doorway, I looked back one final time. The last desk was waiting, pulled just a little farther away than all the others, as though someone unseen had quietly made room for one more student. The morning carried the quiet promise of clear weather. The clouds that had hidden the mountain for days had finally drifted away, leaving the sky a gentle shade of blue. Sunlight reached the valley floor without effort, touching rooftops, fields, and narrow footpaths with the soft warmth of early autumn. From the porch of the guest house, I watched thin threads of smoke rise from chimneys until they disappeared into the open air. For a little while, I almost believed the village had begun to trust me, or perhaps I had simply grown used to its mysteries. After breakfast, I wandered west, following a trail I had not noticed before. It curved through a grove of tall cedar trees whose branches filled the air with a clean, earthy scent. The farther I walked, the quieter the village became until even the sounds of morning faded behind the trees. The trail ended at a narrow wooden bridge. It crossed a dry riverbed. No water flowed beneath it. Only smooth stones, pale sand, and scattered branches rested below, as though a river had once belonged there before quietly changing its mind. The The bridge itself looked old, but well cared for. Fresh planks had replaced broken ones over the years, yet the handrails still carried the dark color of aged cedar. Someone visited this place often. I stepped onto the bridge. The boards answered with gentle creaks beneath my weight. Halfway across, I noticed the carvings. 7 names, each one carefully cut into the railing, not scratched in haste, carved with patience by steady hands. Some had faded with time. Others remained surprisingly clear. I read them one by one. None sounded familiar. At the end of the list, there was empty space, almost as though another name had once belonged there. I rested my fingers lightly against the wood. The carvings felt smooth from years of weather. Behind me, a breeze wandered through the cedar branches, carrying the dry whisper of needles brushing together overhead. I crossed to the other side and followed the trail for several minutes. It ended in an open meadow. Nothing unusual waited there, only tall grass moving beneath the afternoon sun. After a short walk, I turned back toward the bridge. As I stepped onto it again, something caught my eye. I looked toward the railing. One of the names was gone, not worn away, gone. The wood where it had been carved looked untouched, as though no letters had ever marked the surface. I stood there for several moments, tried to remember whether I had counted correctly. Perhaps there had only been 6 names. No, I was certain there had been 7. I counted again. 6. The empty space at the end remained. A quiet uneasiness settled over me. I left the bridge without another word. That evening, while eating supper at the guest house, I found myself thinking about the missing name. I considered asking someone about the bridge, but the memory of the villagers' silence around the chapel held my tongue. Some questions seemed unwelcome here. The next morning, I returned. The bridge waited exactly as before. The dry riverbed stretched beneath it, silent beneath the growing daylight. I walked directly to the railing. 5 names. I blinked. There had been 6 yesterday. I traced each carving carefully. The missing spaces showed no sign that letters had ever existed, only smooth cedar. I laughed quietly under my breath. It sounded uncertain. Perhaps I was confusing memory with imagination. The village had a way of making ordinary things feel uncertain. Still, I reached into my pocket and removed a small notebook. One by one, I copied the remaining 5 names before closing it again. There, I whispered. Now I know. Satisfied, I crossed the bridge once more. The afternoon passed peacefully. I visited the village square, shared tea with an elderly woman who spoke mostly about the changing seasons, helped a farmer gather apples that had fallen outside the old orchard. For several hours, I almost forgot the bridge. Just before sunset, I opened my notebook. The page was blank, not erased, blank. Only faint impressions remained where the pencil had once pressed into the paper. I hurried back to the bridge. Evening shadows stretched across the valley as I arrived. 4 names, only 4. My pulse quickened. This time I knew I wasn't mistaken. I counted twice. Then again. 4. The breeze stirred gently through the cedars. Somewhere high above, a lone crow crossed the fading sky. I stared at the empty spaces along the railing. A strange thought entered my mind. What if the names were not disappearing from a bridge? What if they were disappearing from memory first, and what simply followed? The idea settled more heavily than I cared to admit. I turned away, halfway across the bridge. Something urged me to stop. Slowly, I looked back over my shoulder. 3 names remained. One of them seemed oddly familiar. I leaned closer. The letters sharpened in the fading light. It wasn't familiar. It was mine. My name rested quietly among the remaining carvings, as though it had always belonged there. I searched for the others. The faces connected to the vanished names had already begun slipping away from me. I couldn't remember how they sounded, or even whether I had truly read them. Only my own remained perfectly clear. The evening grew colder. The cedar branches swayed softly overhead. I stood alone on the bridge until the last light faded from the mountains, unable to decide which frightened me more, that my name had appeared, or that I could no longer remember the names that had come before it. The bridge stayed in my thoughts long after I left it. That night, sleep came in short pieces. Each time I woke, I found myself reaching for the notebook on the table beside my bed, hoping the missing names had somehow returned. Every page remained blank, except for my own scattered notes about the village. I could remember writing them. I simply couldn't remember what had disappeared. By morning, I decided I needed to leave again. Not because I wanted to, because I was beginning to wonder if waiting any longer would make leaving impossible. The villagers watched quietly as I packed my car. A few offered polite smiles. An elderly woman handed me a small loaf of bread wrapped in linen. "For the road," she said. I thanked her. She hesitated before adding, "If the bus comes first, take it." I frowned. "There isn't a bus out here." "There is." She looked toward the empty road. "It always arrives." Before I could ask another question, she walked away. The sky was bright enough to cast long shadows across the fields as I waited beside my car. The mountains stood perfectly clear against the morning light. Nothing moved except a few leaves carried lazily across the road. Then I heard it. An engine. Old. Heavy. The sound echoed through the valley before the vehicle itself appeared. A faded cream-colored bus rounded the bend. Its paint had peeled away in thin strips, revealing older layers beneath. The windows were slightly cloudy with age, and its headlights glowed even under the morning sun. What unsettled me most was the road. There wasn't one. The bus rolled smoothly across an open field where only grass should have been. It slowed beside me. The folding door opened with a tired sigh. The driver looked to be in his late 60s. His gray cap rested neatly above calm, thoughtful eyes. "Morning," he said. His voice carried the relaxed tone of someone greeting a regular passenger. "Morning. You've been waiting. I wasn't expecting a bus." He smiled gently. Most people aren't. Something inside me whispered that I should stay with my car. Something stronger told me to step aboard. The air inside smelled faintly of worn leather, old paper, and years of quiet journeys. The seats showed their age but remained carefully repaired. Brass handrails caught the morning light in soft reflections. Every seat was occupied. Men, women, an elderly couple, a young mother holding a sleeping child. No one spoke. Every passenger sat with their eyes closed, not sleeping, just closed, as though they had agreed not to look outside. I chose an empty seat halfway down the aisle. The fabric beneath my hand felt smooth from countless travelers before me. The bus pulled away without a sound beyond the steady engine. Outside, the village slipped behind the trees. For the first time since arriving, I felt certain I was finally leaving. The driver spoke without turning around. "Long visit. A few days. It feels longer." I glanced toward the front. "What makes you say that?" "You've forgotten how long you've been here." His words settled over me. I checked my watch. The date looked correct. Didn't it? I reached into my pocket for my phone. The battery had died sometime during the morning. Strange. I could have sworn it had been fully charged. The road outside unfolded through forests and open meadows I didn't recognize. Or perhaps I did. Each hill carried a faint sense of familiarity that slipped away before I could hold on to it. The passengers never moved. Not one shifted in a seat. Not one opened their eyes. Even when the bus rounded sharp bends, they remained perfectly still. I leaned toward the aisle and quietly asked the man across from me, "Excuse me?" No answer. His breathing remained slow and even. I tried again. Nothing. The driver chuckled softly. "They won't answer." "Why not?" "They're remembering." I waited. He offered nothing more. The bus continued climbing through the mountains. Clouds drifted across the road, briefly hiding the sunlight before breaking apart again. We passed old fences, abandoned barns, and fields where no animals grazed. I looked toward the seat directly in front of me. It was empty. Hadn't someone been sitting there earlier? I frowned, trying to picture the face. Nothing came. A strange uneasiness settled over me. I turned to look behind. The aisle stretched quietly toward the rear window. Every passenger remained seated exactly as before, except my seat. It was empty. I froze. I looked down. I could feel the worn fabric beneath me. My hands rested on my knees. My feet touched the floor. I was there. I knew I was there. Yet in the reflection of the rear window, the seat I occupied held no one, only the gentle rise and fall of the bus as it traveled the mountain road. I blinked hard. The reflection didn't change. The driver spoke again, almost kindly. Reflections don't always travel with us. My mouth felt dry. What does that mean? It means you're getting closer. Closer to what? He didn't answer. Instead, he reached forward and pulled a small cord hanging beside his seat. A single bell chimed softly. The bus slowed. It stopped beside another empty stretch of road. The door folded open. No buildings. No signs. Only a narrow path disappearing into a stand of tall trees. The driver looked at me in the mirror. This is your stop. I don't think it is. It always has been. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, almost reluctantly, I stood. As I stepped onto the roadside, I looked back through the open door. Every passenger still sat with closed eyes. The driver tipped his cap. The doors closed. The bus rolled quietly forward. After only a few seconds, it disappeared behind the trees. The engine faded into the distance. I remained alone beside the narrow path. Only then did I notice one final detail. In the soft dust where the bus had stopped, there were tire tracks, but there was only one set of footprints. Mine. The narrow path left by the bus wound back toward the village, as though it had always been there. I followed it through tall grass that brushed gently against my legs, listening to the quiet rhythm of my own footsteps. The afternoon carried a faint warmth despite the late season, and sunlight filtered through the trees in long golden bands that shifted whenever the branches moved. I kept thinking about the empty reflection. Every few minutes I caught myself looking into the dark screen of my phone, half expecting not to see my own face. The screen remained lifeless, reflecting only a faint outline that vanished whenever I changed the angle. I slipped it back into my pocket. Some questions could wait. By the time I reached the village, the smell of baking bread drifted through the streets. It was rich and inviting, the sort of scent that usually made a place feel like home. Villagers moved quietly from house to house carrying baskets covered with linen cloths. A little girl hurried past me with flour dusted across the front of her sweater, smiling as though she had won some small secret game. I followed the smell until it led me to a small bakery near the center of the square. Its windows glowed softly. Fresh loaves rested behind the glass, their crusts deep brown and still warm enough to release thin ribbons of steam. Above the doorway hung a weathered wooden sign that creaked gently whenever the breeze found it. The door opened with little effort. Warm air settled around me at once. The room smelled of fresh flour, melted butter, and rising dough. Wooden shelves held rows of bread, arranged with almost perfect care. Behind the counter stood no baker, no customers, only the quiet ticking of a small kitchen timer, somewhere out of sight. "Hello," I called. My voice drifted toward the back room and faded. No answer came. I waited politely for a minute before stepping behind the counter. The oven stood cold. Their heavy iron doors rested slightly open, revealing dark interiors without the faintest glow of embers. That should have been impossible. The bread cooling on the shelves could not have come from cold ovens. I reached toward the nearest loaf. Its crust was still warm, fresh enough that a little steam escaped when I lifted it. I turned it over in my hands. The warmth felt real. The scent was comforting. Yet every oven remained dark. Curiosity led me farther into bakery. Beyond the kitchen stood a narrow storage room lined with sacks of flour stacked almost to the ceiling. The floor carried a thin layer of white dust marked only by my own footprints. At the far wall, hidden partly behind two empty barrels, I noticed a wooden door no larger than a cellar entrance. It stood slightly open. Cool air drifted upward through the narrow gap. I pulled it wider. Stone steps disappeared into darkness below. The smell changed immediately. The sweetness of fresh bread gave way to something sharper. A faint trace of copper lingered in the air, subtle enough that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. I stood at the top of the stairs for several moments. Common sense suggested turning around. Instead, I began to descend. The steps were worn smooth by many years of use. Each one echoed softly beneath my weight before the sound disappeared into the darkness below. At the bottom, the passage opened into a small underground room. The ceiling was low, Stone walls surrounded an old wooden table scattered with mixing bowls, rolling pins, and empty baking trays. There was no oven, no fireplace, no chimney, nothing that could have baked the bread waiting upstairs. Yet the room was warm, not unpleasantly warm, just enough that it felt as though someone had been working there only moments before. Then I heard it, the steady rhythm of kneading. Press, fold, turn, press. It came from somewhere beyond the far wall. I walked toward the sound until I found another doorway covered by a heavy linen curtain. The cloth moved gently, though no breeze reached the room. I hesitated only a moment before drawing it aside. Beyond lay another chamber, smaller, empty. A single wooden table stood in the center. Upon it rested a fresh loaf of bread. Steam rose lazily from its crust. The kneading sound stopped. The room fell completely quiet. I looked around. No one, not even another door. The sound had ended as though the unseen baker had simply finished working. Slowly, I approached the table. The loaf looked perfect, golden, round, its surface cracked in delicate patterns from the heat. Without thinking, I smiled. Bread had always reminded me of Sunday mornings when my mother would bake before anyone else woke. I used to wait beside the kitchen until she handed me the first slice, still too warm to hold comfortably. The memory lingered long enough for me to forget where I was. I reached for the loaf. My fingers paused. Near the edge of the crust was a small crescent-shaped mark. A bite. I frowned. Someone had already tasted it. I leaned closer. The mark looked strangely familiar, not because I had seen it before, because it matched the slight gap between two teeth on the left side of my own bite, a habit my dentist had pointed out years ago. Slowly, almost unwillingly, I raised the loaf toward my face. The shape aligned perfectly, as though I had taken that bite myself. Only, I hadn't. A quiet unease settled over me. I carefully returned the loaf to the table. The room remained silent. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing. I backed away toward the curtain without turning around. When I reached the doorway, the smell of fresh bread returned, washing over the sharper scent that lingered below. I climbed the stairs one careful step at a time. The bakery upstairs looked exactly as I had left it. Rows of warm loaves waited on their shelves. The timer had stopped ticking. Outside, evening light stretched across the village square. I stepped into the street and closed the door behind me. Just before walking away, I glanced back through the bakery window. One loaf now rested alone on the front shelf, golden, perfectly round, with a single bite missing from its crust, exactly where mine would have been. Even after leaving the bakery, the smell of fresh bread seemed to follow me through the village. It lingered in my thoughts more than in the air, tied to the impossible loaf waiting beneath the ground. By the time the sun slipped behind a western ridge, I had almost convinced myself that exhaustion had played tricks on my mind. Almost. That evening, the villagers gathered quietly in the square before returning to their homes one by one. No children ran through the streets. No one lingered to talk beneath the lanterns. As darkness settled over the valley, every doorway closed with gentle care until only a few windows still glowed against the night. I remembered the old woman's warning from my first day. Do not look toward the hill after midnight. I had kept that promise. I intended to keep it again. Sleep came slowly. When I finally opened my eyes, the room was dark except for a thin band of moonlight stretching across the floorboards. My watch showed a little after midnight. Everything was quiet. Then came a single sound. A bucket, not falling, lowering. The old wooden pulley outside the window turned with a slow, steady rhythm. Curiosity tugged at me before caution could stop it. I slipped on my coat and stepped into the cool night air. The sound led me through the sleeping village toward the old stone well standing near the center of a small clearing. Moonlight rested across its circular wall, making the weathered stone shine with a pale silver glow. A rope disappeared into the darkness below, though no one stood nearby to pull it. The bucket rose gently on its own. It reached the top. It stopped. Water dripped softly back into the well. I waited for someone to appear. No one did. The night carried the clean scent that follows weeks without rain, fresh enough to make the valley feel newly washed. A light breeze stirred the leaves overhead, but the rope hanging above the bucket remained perfectly still. I stepped closer. The stone rim felt cool beneath my fingertips. Slowly, I leaned forward and looked inside. I expected to see the moon reflected in the water. Instead, I saw a face. Not mine. An elderly man stared upward with calm, thoughtful eyes. He smiled. A heartbeat later. The delay was small, just enough to feel wrong. I jerked backward. The reflection vanished. Only dark water remained. My breathing settled after a few moments. You imagined it. I whispered. The words sounded smaller than I intended. Carefully, I looked again. This time a young woman gazed back at me. I had never seen her before. She smiled. Again, a moment too late. The smile arrived after I had already begun to straighten. I stepped away from the well. The clearing remained empty. No footsteps. No voices. Only the quiet creak of the old pulley as the bucket lowered itself once more. The next morning, I mentioned the well to an elderly woman arranging flowers outside her home. She stopped tying the stems together. You were there after sunset? I nodded. She lowered her eyes. No one draws water after dark. Why? The well remembers faces. I waited for her to explain. She only returned to her flowers. By afternoon, my curiosity had become stronger than my good judgment. I returned to the clearing while the sun still hung high above the mountains. Children crossed a nearby path carrying baskets of apples. Two men repaired a fence not far away. The well looked perfectly ordinary. A young boy noticed me standing there. Looking for water? He asked. He shook his head. Best to come before evening. Does the water taste different? He thought about the question. I don't know. You've never tried it? My grandmother says we already have enough reflections. Before I could ask what he meant, he hurried away. I stood alone again. This time I looked into the well under the full light of day. The water was perfectly clear. It should have reflected the bright sky above. It didn't. Faces drifted slowly beneath the surface. A little girl, an old woman, a man with a heavy beard. None of them looked frightened. None of them looked trapped. They simply watched. One by one, each smiled, always a heartbeat too late. I counted 7 different faces before the surface became still. Only then did my own reflection appear. Relief washed over me. At last, something familiar. I smiled at myself. The reflection remained expressionless. A full second passed. Then, it smiled back. My heart tightened. I did not move. Neither did it. The smile stayed fixed long after mine had faded. Very slowly, the reflected version of me lifted one hand. I hadn't. It pressed its palm against the inside of the water, as though the surface were glass instead of a reflection. I stumbled backward. A pebble rolled from beneath my boot and dropped into the well. Ripples spread outward. Every face disappeared. Only ordinary water remained. That evening, I walked through the village searching for anyone willing to answer my questions. Doors closed politely. Conversations drifted elsewhere whenever I mentioned the well. Even the priest simply bowed his head. There are places, he said quietly, that ask more questions than they answer. Night settled once more over the valley. From my window, I could just make out the stone circle of the well beneath the moonlight. For a long time, nothing happened. Then a pale face rose slowly into view above the rim. It looked directly toward my room. I held my breath. The distance was too great to make out its features. Yet, somehow, I knew it wasn't looking for me. It was waiting for the reflection that had smiled back. Late the next afternoon, the village seemed quieter than it had ever been. The market had closed early. Doors remained open just long enough for people to carry in baskets of vegetables or armfuls of firewood before disappearing inside again. Even the birds that usually cross the valley in small groups had vanished into the forest, leaving the sky strangely empty. I walked without any destination in mind. The road carried me beyond the last row of cottages, where the hills became steeper and the trees stood farther apart. A narrow footpath climbed toward a small cottage resting alone on a ridge. Its chimney released a thin trail of smoke. Someone, I thought, must still live there. The cottage was modest. White walls, a slate roof darkened by many winters. Blue shutters framed 2 narrow windows. each covered by pale curtains that glowed softly in the afternoon light. The place felt peaceful, almost inviting. A wooden gate stood open. I stepped through. Lavender bushes grew beside the stone walkway, though most of their flowers had already faded with the season. Their gentle scent lingered in the cool air, reminding me of the small bundle the elderly woman had pressed into my hand on my first evening in the village. The memory eased something inside me. I climbed the porch steps and knocked. No answer. I waited. Still nothing. The front door, left slightly open, drifted inward with a breeze. Hello. Only the quiet crackle of a fireplace answered. Inside, everything appeared perfectly cared for. A teapot rested beside 2 cups. A knitted blanket lay across a rocking chair. Books lined a shelf near the hearth. Their spines faded with age. Someone had dusted them recently. The cottage did not feel abandoned. It felt interrupted. I wandered from room to room. Each carried the same gentle warmth, the same calm order. Nothing seemed out of place. Then I noticed the light outside. The afternoon sun rested low above the western hills. I smiled. I'd spent longer here than I realized. Turning toward the door, I paused. The sunlight entering through the front window had grown brighter, not dimmer. I looked outside. The sun was climbing, slowly, silently, back into the sky. My breath caught. The shadows stretching across the yard shortened before my eyes. The valley brightened. Within moments, the entire hillside glowed with the warm colors of late afternoon once again. Another sunset began. Golden light spilled across the lavender bushes exactly as it had nearly an hour earlier. The same breeze lifted the curtains. The same long beam of light crossed the floor. I stood perfectly still. The day had repeated itself. Not the whole day, only its ending. I stepped onto the porch. The village below looked unchanged. Smoke rose from chimneys. A shepherd guided a few goats toward their pen. Nothing suggested that time itself had quietly folded over. Slowly, the second sunset reached its end. The sky deepened into orange, then crimson, then violet. At last, darkness settled across the valley. This time, it remained. I returned inside, hoping to understand what had happened. The fire still burned. The teapot remained warm. One room upstairs caught my attention. Its door stood half open. I climbed the narrow staircase, each step answering with a soft creak beneath my weight. The upper hallway held only 2 rooms. One contained a neatly made bed facing a single window. The other appeared to be a study. Papers rested across a writing desk. A fountain pen waited beside an unfinished letter. No ink had dried in its tip. It looked as though the writer had stood only moments before. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Above me. I froze. There wasn't another floor. The sound came again. One step. Then another. Slow. Measured. Crossing the ceiling directly overhead. Every hair along my arms lifted. I looked upward. The ceiling remained still. The footsteps continued, traveling from one end of the cottage to the other. Then they stopped. A deep quiet settled over the house. I told myself it must be the roof settling as the evening cooled. Old homes often made unexpected sounds. The explanation lasted only until I noticed the dust. Tiny grains drifted downward from the ceiling, as though someone had just walked across the floor above. Very carefully, I climbed onto the chair beneath the attic hatch. There wasn't one, only solid beams. No staircase, no ladder, no attic at all. The footsteps resumed. This time they crossed directly over where I stood. 1, 2, 3, 4. I climbed down slowly. The sound ended. I laughed softly to myself, though it did little to calm my nerves. I've had enough for one day. My own voice seemed unusually loud inside the quiet cottage. I started toward the stairs. Halfway down, I stopped. A faint warmth brushed across the back of my neck. Not a breeze. Something else. I turned. The upstairs hallway was empty. Yet from somewhere near the study came the unmistakable sound of footsteps again. Not above me, inside the room. I walked back. The study door remained open exactly as before. The chair sat tucked neatly beneath the desk. Nothing had moved. Then I noticed the floor. A thin trail of fresh dust crossed the wooden boards. Footprints. Small, bare. They began near the far wall and ended in front of the window. There were no prints leading away, only those arriving. Outside, the last colors of evening faded behind the mountains. The window reflected the room back at me. For just an instant, another figure seemed to stand beside my reflection. When I turned, the room was empty. When I looked back, only my own reflection remained. But I no longer felt certain that the footsteps had ever belonged to someone upstairs. Morning arrived beneath a sky filled with long, pale clouds that stretched from one mountain to the next. The village woke slowly, as it always did. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Doors opened one by one. And somewhere in the distance a rooster called into the cool air before falling quiet again. I left soon after breakfast. The cottage with the impossible sunset stayed behind me. But strange stillness followed wherever I walked. More than once I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the light reversing itself once again. Instead, I found only the empty road. An elderly farmer passed with a cart full of hay. He nodded politely. "The western field is beautiful this time of year," he said. Then he continued without another word. The western field. Something about the way he said it made the place sound less like a destination and more like an invitation. Curiosity carried me there before noon. The trail climbed gently through open hills where tall grass rolled like quiet waves beneath the breeze. The air smelled warm and dry, carrying the faint scent of sunlit straw. Crickets sang from hidden places among the weeds, their steady rhythm blending into the peaceful afternoon. It was the calmest place I had found since arriving. Then I saw the shepherd. He stood alone near the crest of a hill, leaning lightly on a long wooden staff. At least, I thought he was alone. He wore a weather wool coat that reached almost his boots. His gray beard moved gently whenever the wind crossed the hillside. He looked out across the field, watching something. I followed his gaze. There was nothing there. No sheep, no cattle, only endless grass. I walked closer. "Good afternoon." He smiled without surprise. "Good afternoon." "Beautiful day." "It usually is." His eyes never left the empty hillside. After a long silence, I finally asked a question that had been waiting in my mind. "Are you watching something?" "My flock." I looked again. "Nothing. I don't see any sheep." "They're here." He spoke with complete certainty. Sometimes seeing isn't the important part. The answer lingered between us. He lifted one hand and pointed toward the open field. Then he began to count. 1. A short pause. 4. Another pause. 9. His voice remained steady. 12. 3. I frowned. The numbers made no sense. They didn't rise or fall in any pattern. Each seemed chosen without relation to the last. "You skipped a few." "No." He smiled gently. "I never count the same way twice." He continued. 17. 2. 30. The breeze wandered through the grass, bending it in slow waves that moved across the hillside. I found myself watching those shifting patterns, as though something hidden might reveal itself. Nothing did. The shepherd lowered his staff. "They're all home." He seemed satisfied, though I had seen nothing arrive. We stood together in comfortable silence for several minutes. The peacefulness of the place almost made me forget everything else the village had shown me. Almost. The shepherd spoke again. "You're staying in the guest house." "I am." "You've been to the bridge." "Yes." "The well." "Yes." "The bakery." I nodded once more. He sighed quietly. "You've walked farther than most." His words carried neither approval nor warning, only quiet observation. I looked toward the distant mountains. "Can I ask you something?" "You can." "Why does everyone here act as though these strange things are ordinary?" The shepherd rested both hands on the top of his staff. "When something has always been true," he smiled faintly, "it stops feeling strange." I thought about that. Perhaps he was right. People living beside waterfalls eventually stopped hearing them. Those who watched the mountains every morning no longer noticed their size. Maybe mystery worked the same way. The afternoon drifted by unnoticed. Clouds crossed slowly overhead. The shepherd never moved from his place. Neither did I. Then he spoke without looking at me. If someone calls your name, his voice became almost a whisper. Don't answer. A chill settled quietly across my shoulders. Why? Because they may not be speaking to you. I waited for him to explain. He didn't. The breeze faded. Even the crickets fell silent. The entire hillside seemed to pause. Then it happened, very softly. Behind me, my name, spoken in a calm, familiar voice. Not loud, not frightening, just enough to reach my ears. I knew that voice, for one impossible moment. It sounded exactly like my father's. Every instinct urged me to turn around, to answer, to ask how such a thing could be possible. My lips parted, before a word escaped. The shepherd tapped the ground once with his staff. The sharp sound broke whatever held me. I closed my mouth. My hands trembled. The voice came again, closer this time, gentle, patient, calling my name exactly as my father used to when supper was ready after a long day outside. My eyes filled before I realized why. I hadn't heard that voice in years. It would have been so easy, just one answer, just one word. Instead, I stared at the endless field ahead. The shepherd continued looking toward his invisible flock. Neither of us turned. The voice called a third time. Then, nothing. The breeze returned. The crickets began singing again. The tall grass swayed beneath the afternoon light, as though the silence had never existed. The shepherd finally nodded. You did well. I swallowed carefully. Who was that? His expression remained gentle. I don't know. He lifted his staff and started walking slowly across the hillside. After a few steps, he looked back. Neither do they. With that, he continued into the sea of grass. Within moments, the rolling hills hid him from view. I remained standing where I was. For a long time, I listened. The field had become peaceful once more. But I chose not to look behind me until I had reached the village again. The guest house felt different after the shepherd's warning. Nothing inside had changed. The same wooden chair stood beside the window. The same woven rug covered the floor. My travel bag rested where I had left it on the small table. Yet every familiar object seemed to carry a quiet distance, as though I were visiting a place I had once known instead of living there. That evening, I found myself checking the window more often than I cared to admit. It was the only one in the room without curtains. When I asked a woman who cared for the house about it over supper, she simply smiled. It has always been that way. Would you mind if I hung a blanket over it? Her smile faded. I would. She looked toward the uncovered glass for a moment. It wouldn't stay. She offered no further explanation. After the meal, I carried a chair beside the window and sat watching the forest that bordered the village. The last colors of sunset faded gently behind the trees until the woods became a single dark shape against the sky. The scent of fresh pine drifted through the open window. It was clean, calming. For a little while, I almost forgot the strange days behind me, the bridge with the disappearing names, the well that reflected unfamiliar faces, the shepherd who counted sheep no one could see. I told myself that the night would pass quietly. It didn't. Just before midnight, every sound in the village disappeared. No insects, no breeze. Even the old floorboards beneath the house seemed to settle into perfect stillness. I looked at my watch. A few minutes remained before 12. Without thinking, I remembered the elderly woman's first warning. Do not look toward the hill after midnight. I had obeyed that warning every night. Tonight, another thought replaced it. What if the danger was on a hill? What if it was somewhere closer? The clock on the bedside table reached midnight with a soft click. Nothing happened. I let out a slow breath. Then I noticed movement beyond the trees. At the edge of the forest, where the moonlight reached only the first line of trunks, someone stood perfectly still, too far away to recognize, too close to ignore. The figure faced the guest house. Its outline was clear against the pale glow behind it. A long coat, arms resting quietly at its sides. No face, only darkness where its features should have been. I remained seated. The figure did not move. Minutes slipped by. Neither of us changed. The pine scent continued drifting into the room, carrying with it the cool air of the mountains. I rubbed my hands together, trying to convince myself that I was only looking at an unusually shaped tree. Then the figure lifted one hand. A slow, gentle wave. Not calling, not demanding, simply acknowledging me. My stomach tightened. It was the same quiet gesture I had seen near the endless road beyond the bridge. The memory returned with surprising clarity. Before I realized what I was doing, I lifted my own hand slightly from the arm of the chair. I stopped before returning the wave. The figure lowered its arm. Then, instead of walking toward the village, it stepped backward. One slow step, another. Each movement carried it deeper into the darkness between the trees. It never turned around. It simply retreated until the forest swallowed it completely. The woods became empty once more. I stayed by the window for a long time. Eventually, the ordinary sounds of the night returned. Leaves whispered softly. An owl called from somewhere beyond the ridge. The strange stillness had passed, or so I believed. I rose from the chair and crossed the room to pour myself a glass of water. When I turned back toward the window, something caught my attention. There were faint marks in the dust outside, not footprints. The ground beneath the window was too firm to hold them. These were narrow lines, almost like something had been lightly dragged across the earth. They began at the forest edge. They ended directly beneath my window. I stared at them until my eyes grew tired. The moon slipped behind a cloud, dimming the clearing outside. When the light returned a few moments later, the marks were gone. Morning arrived bright and quiet. I stepped outside as soon as the sun rose. The ground beneath the window looked untouched. No lines, no broken grass, no sign that anyone or anything had stood there during the night. As I walked toward the village square, I passed the elderly woman who had first warned me about the hill. She looked at me for a long moment. "You kept the window open," she said. "I did." "And you saw someone." It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" She folded her hands together. "Everyone who stays in that room sees the watcher eventually." I felt a chill despite the warmth of the morning. "Who is it?" Her eyes drifted toward the forest. "I've lived here almost 80 years. She smiled sadly. "I've never seen its face." She started walking away. After only a few steps, she paused without turning around. "It always leaves before dawn." "Why?" She remained silent long enough that I thought she hadn't heard me. Then she answered so quietly that I almost missed the words. "Because it is waiting for the night you decide to wave back." The morning after I saw the watcher, the village carried on as though nothing had happened. Doors opened. Bread cooled on windowsills. A woman swept fallen leaves from her porch with slow, careful strokes. The ordinary rhythm should have comforted me. Instead, it made the night feel even more difficult to understand. I considered leaving again. The thought came and went before I had finished breakfast. Every attempt to escape had brought me back to the same valley. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped believing that roads alone could carry me out, so I walked instead. The market square sat near the center of the village, surrounded by small wooden stalls beneath faded canvas roofs. When I first arrived, I imagined it would be busy on a clear autumn morning. It wasn't. The stalls were open. Every table was neatly arranged. Baskets overflowed with apples, potatoes, onions, and bundles of herbs tied with thin pieces of twine. Handmade blankets hung from wooden poles beside polished tools and carefully carved toys. Everything looked ready for customers. There were none. Not a single buyer wandered between the stalls. No children asked for sweets. No travelers stopped to rest. Only the merchants remained. An old woman arranged jars of honey into perfect rows. A man polished wooden bowls one at a time, returning each to exactly the same place. Another vendor carefully folded and unfolded the same piece of cloth over and over. They all smiled politely when they noticed me. None of them spoke. The scent of woven baskets and dried herbs drifted gently through the square, warm and earthy beneath the morning sun. I approached the honey seller first. "Good morning." She smiled. "Good morning. It's very quiet today." "It usually is." "Do customers come later?" She tilted her head slightly, as though I had asked a curious question. "They already have." I looked around. The square remained empty. "I'm sorry," I said. "I don't see anyone." "You will..." Her answer settled into the silence. Before I could ask another question, she turned back to arranging her jars. I wandered farther into market. Every merchant worked with the same calm focus. No one called out to attract buyers. No one bargained. It was less like a marketplace, and more like a memory of one. As I crossed the center of the square, something made me stop. The sunlight. I looked at the shadow stretching from my feet. It pointed west. I glanced at my watch. Nearly noon. The shadow should have been much shorter. I frowned and continued walking. Half an hour later, I checked again. The shadow hadn't moved. Neither had the light. The warm afternoon remained frozen exactly where it had been. I found the priest watering flowers outside the chapel. "Father," he looked up with a gentle smile. "You've noticed the sun hasn't moved." "No. How long has it been like this?" He rested the watering can beside the steps. "It depends who you ask." "What does that mean?" "For some people," he looked toward the bright sky, "today lasts only a few hours. And for others, it lasts much longer." His words offered no comfort. I left the chapel and returned to the square. Nothing had changed. The same woman continued arranging honey. The same man polished the same bowl. A breeze wandered to the market, lifting the edge of a canvas roof before settling again. Even the shadows remained exactly where they had been. Hours seemed to pass. My watch insisted that time moved normally. The sky disagreed. Late, or what should have been late, I stopped beside a stall filled with woven baskets. The merchant, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked at me as though she had been expecting me. Without a word, she reached beneath the table and placed an old copper coin into my hand. Its surface felt warm. I looked down. A small scratch crossed one side near the edge. My breath caught. I knew that scratch. Years ago, when I was 10, my grandfather had given me a lucky coin before my first day at school. Nervous, I had dropped it onto the stone steps outside our house, leaving a tiny mark across its face. I carried it for years, until the day I lost it during a family trip. I had searched everywhere. We never found it. Slowly, I turned the coin over. The scratch was there, exactly where I remembered. "This..." My voice faltered. "Where did you get this?" The merchant smiled gently. "You left it here. I've never been here before." "Haven't you?" There was no challenge in her voice, only quiet certainty. I slipped the coin into my pocket. It fit there as naturally as though it had never been missing. The afternoon remained unchanged. The sun refused to move. The shadows refused to lengthen. At last, I returned to the center of the square. Every merchant looked up together. Not quickly, not sharply, simply at the same moment. Their smiles never faded, yet none of them blinked. For several long seconds, every face remained turned toward me. Then, just as quietly, they returned to their work. The market resumed its endless routine. As I walked away, my hand tightened around the old coin inside my pocket. For the first time since arriving in the village, I began to wonder if I hadn't wandered into a forgotten place at all. Perhaps I had wandered into a place that remembered me better than I remembered myself. The coin stayed in my pocket all through the night. Every so often, I would reach down to make sure it was still there. The small scratch beneath my thumb felt exactly as I remembered. It should have comforted me. Instead, it left me wondering how many other things I had once lost without realizing where they had gone. By morning, the sky had returned to normal. The sun climbed steadily above the eastern ridge, and for the first time in days, its movement felt reassuring. Shadows stretched and shortened exactly as they should. The village carried on with its quiet routines, as though the endless afternoon had never happened. I decided to leave the roads behind. A narrow trail climbed into the forest north of the village, disappearing between tall pines whose branches filtered the morning light into soft green patches across the ground. The air smelled clean and carried the faint scent of damp bark after a cool night. The farther I walked, the quieter the village became. Soon, I could hear only my own footsteps and the gentle rustle of needles high above. The climb grew steeper. After nearly an hour, the trees opened onto the top of a broad hill. At its center stood a lighthouse that I stopped. For several long moments, I simply stared. It rose from the middle of the forest, exactly as a lighthouse should rise from the edge of the sea. White stone walls reached toward the sky, weathered by countless seasons. A narrow balcony circled the lantern room at the top, where great panes of glass reflected the morning sun. There was no ocean, only mountains in every direction. The sight felt so misplaced that my mind searched for a sensible explanation. None came. A gravel path led to the entrance. The wooden door stood slightly open. As I stepped inside, the cool stone walls muffled the sounds of the forest behind me. A spiral staircase curved upward, worn smooth by years of careful footsteps. The smell surprised me. A faint trace of salt lingered in the air, not strong enough to overpower the scent of old stone and polished wood, just enough to remind me of childhood holidays at the coast, where waves rolled endlessly against weathered piers. I smiled despite myself. I had not thought about the sea in years. Most people do. The voice echoed softly above me. I looked up. An elderly man descended the staircase with slow, steady steps. His blue coat was neatly buttoned despite its age, and a brass key hung from a cord around his neck. "You look surprised," he said with a gentle smile. "I wasn't expecting a lighthouse." "Very few are." He reached the bottom step and offered a polite nod. "I keep the light." I glanced toward the ceiling. "For ships?" His eyes drifted toward the narrow windows. "For those who remember them." The answer settled quietly between us. He turned toward the staircase again. "You're welcome to climb." I followed. The stairs wound higher and higher until the forest disappeared beneath the windows. Sunlight spilled across the stone walls as we reached the lantern room. The great lens filled the center of the chamber. Crystal panels curved around a polished brass frame that looked older than the village itself. The mechanism moved, slowly, smoothly, yet I felt no wind. Outside, the trees stood almost perfectly still. "What turns it?" I asked. The keeper rested one hand lightly against the railing. "It always turns." "No engine?" "No. No wind." He smiled. "It remembers the way." The lantern completed another slow circle. Golden light swept across the endless forest. For a heartbeat, I imagined I saw distant waves glimmering beyond the trees. When I blinked, they were gone. The keeper noticed my expression. The sea once reached this hill. I looked out through the glass. "There's never been a sea here." "There has." His voice carried no doubt. "It simply left before your maps were drawn." I could not tell whether he was sharing history or memory. Perhaps. In this village, they were the same thing. We stood together in silence as the lantern continued its endless turning. Then something changed. The beam reached the northern side of the room. Instead of shining across the forest, it bent downward. Light passed through the floor, not reflected, not scattered. It continued beneath us as though the stone itself had become transparent. A pale column disappeared into the earth. I stepped closer. Far below, beneath layers of rock that should have hidden everything, I thought I saw a movement. Not people, not animals. Tiny lights, dozens of them, slowly drifting through darkness like distant lanterns carried along invisible roads. My breath caught. "What are they?" The keeper watched quietly. "They're almost home." The beam moved on. The lights vanished. Stone became ordinary once more. The room grew still. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, I asked a question that had settled deepest in my mind. "Why show me this?" He studied me with calm, thoughtful eyes. I didn't. The lighthouse did. We descended the staircase together. At the doorway, the keeper handed me a small seashell. Its surface was smooth, warmed by water that could not possibly have reached these mountains. "For the journey," he said. I turned the shell over in my hand. It felt warm despite the cool morning air. When I looked up to thank him, he had already stepped back inside. The door closed softly. I began walking down the forest trail. Halfway to the village, I paused, very faintly, carried on the breeze through miles of pine trees. I heard waves breaking against a distant shore. When I turned toward the sound, there was nothing beyond the forest but mountains stretching into the quiet afternoon. The seashell rested on the table beside my bed that night. Before falling asleep, I held it to my ear expecting nothing more than an old childhood trick. As a boy, I believed every shell carried the voice of the ocean inside it. My father never corrected me. He simply smiled and listened with me. This time, I heard no sea, only a long, gentle silence. When morning came, the shell felt colder than the room around it. I slipped it into my coat pocket before leaving the guest house. Something told me it belonged with me now. The village greeted another quiet day. A baker swept flour from his doorstep. Two women exchanged baskets without speaking. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once before settling again. I wandered beyond the last cottages until an overgrown path appeared between rows of old pine trees. I didn't remember seeing it before. The trail narrowed with every step. Soft moss covered the ground, carrying the fresh scent of damp earth left behind by the night's dew. Fallen leaves muffled my footsteps until even my own movement seemed to disappear into the forest. Ahead stood a rusted iron gate. It leaned slightly to one side, wrapped in climbing ivy that had almost hidden its shape. Beyond it lay a forgotten cemetery. The gate stood closed. I paused only a moment before reaching for its handle. Before my hand touched the iron, the gate opened by itself. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to welcome me inside. The old hinges made almost no sound. I remained still. No breeze had moved. No one stood nearby. Yet the entrance waited. Slowly I stepped through. Rows of weathered headstones stretched across the hillside beneath towering trees. Moss softened their edges, and small white flowers had rooted themselves between the graves as though no one had disturbed them for generations. Something felt wrong. It took me several moments to understand why. Every headstone faced away, instead of looking toward the graves they marked. Each stone had been turned toward the forest beyond, as though the dead were watching the trees instead of the village. I walked carefully between them. Names had faded beneath years of rain and sunlight. Some stones carried dates. Others held only simple carvings of birds, lanterns, or branches. None faced the graves behind them. The silence here felt different, not frightening, respectful, as though the entire hillside had agreed to speak only in whispers. Near the center of the cemetery stood a single grave apart from the others. Its stone was newer, cleaner. No moss covered its surface. I approached quietly. There was no name, no date, only smooth gray stone waiting for words that had never been carved. I rested my fingers lightly against it. The stone felt cool despite the warmth of the afternoon. Not everyone is ready. The voice came gently from behind me. I turned. An elderly groundskeeper stood beside a wheelbarrow filled with fresh flowers. His coat carried bits of moss along the sleeves, and a small pair of pruning shears hung from his belt. I hadn't heard him arrive. "Whose grave is this?" I asked. He looked at the blank stone. "We'll know when the time comes." "It hasn't been chosen?" "Oh, it has." He smiled kindly. "It simply hasn't remembered its name yet." His answer settled over the quiet hillside like falling leaves. He placed a handful of white flowers beside another grave before continuing his work. I watched him for a while. Every flower found its place with gentle care. None were placed near the unnamed stone. Eventually, I wandered farther through the cemetery. The farther I walked, the more certain I became that someone else was there. Not because I heard footsteps, not because I saw movement, only because the stillness no longer felt empty. I turned more than once. Each time, the rows of headstones remained exactly where they had been. The forest beyond them stood silent beneath the afternoon light. When I returned to the gate, I paused. The unnamed grave remained visible between the others. For reasons I couldn't explain, I raised one hand in a quiet farewell. No one answered. I stepped through the gate. The iron bars began to move. Slowly, steadily. The gate closed behind me with a soft, final click. The sound echoed farther than it should have. I looked back. The cemetery appeared peaceful once more. The groundskeeper was gone. His wheelbarrow had vanished with him. Only the rows of headstones remained, all facing the forest. As I turned toward the village, something brushed against my coat pocket. The seashell. Without thinking, I took it out and held it for a moment. This time, when I lifted it to my ear, I did not hear the ocean. I heard a gate closing, very softly, as though somewhere far beyond the trees. Another visitor had just arrived. The sound of the closing gate stayed with me through the night. It echoed in my dreams without ever becoming louder, like a memory that refused to fade. Each time I woke, I found my hand resting against a seashell in my pocket, as though I had been holding it even in my sleep. By morning, the shell felt warmer again. I took that as a good sign, though I no longer trusted myself to know what a good sign looked like. A thin layer of mist rested over the fields as I left the guest house. The mountains stood quietly beyond it, their peaks hidden beneath a pale morning sky. The village had already begun another ordinary day. Someone chopped firewood behind a cottage. A woman watered flowers outside her door. Life continued, even when time itself seemed uncertain. I wandered into the forest without choosing a direction. The paths had begun to feel strangely familiar. I recognized bent branches, unusual stones, and trees with split trunks that I could not remember passing before. It was as though the woods had slowly introduced themselves while I wasn't paying attention. After nearly an hour, I noticed smoke rising between the trees, not from a chimney, from a narrow pipe attached to a small wooden cabin. The building rested alone in a quiet clearing surrounded by towering pines. Its roof sagged slightly beneath years of snow and rain, yet every window had been carefully cleaned. Tiny brass gears hung from strings beneath the porch roof, turning gently whenever the breeze found them. Each gear clicked softly against the next, never in the same rhythm. I climbed the porch steps. The front door stood open. Inside, clocks covered nearly every wall. Large clocks, small clocks, round faces, square faces. Pocket watches rested inside open cases upon long work tables. Pendulums swung steadily. Some moved quickly. Others barely seemed to move at all. The room carried the warm scent of polished brass and old wood, comforting in a way I couldn't explain. Tick, tick, tick. No two clocks agreed with one another. The sounds overlapped until they became something almost musical. An elderly man sat at the far end of the room beneath a bright window. Tiny tools rested neatly beside him as he repaired an old wristwatch with careful hands. Without looking up, he smiled. "I wonder when you'd arrive. I didn't know this place was here. Most people don't." His voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised. I stepped closer. Every shelf held watches labeled with small handwritten tags. Some names had faded. Others remained clear. I glanced at one. It belonged to a woman I remembered meeting in the village market. Another carried the name of the shepherd. A third belonged to the priest. "They're all from a village," I said. "They are... Do you repair everyone's watches?" "I keep their time safe." The answer felt strangely natural here. I picked up an old pocket watch resting near the edge of the table. Its hands had stopped at exactly 3 minutes past 4. The clockmaker gently took it from my hand. "Not that one. I'm sorry. It isn't finished remembering." He placed it back exactly where it had been. I watched him fit a tiny brass spring into the watch he was repairing. His fingers never trembled. Every movement carried years of practice. "My grandfather repaired clocks," I said quietly. The memory surprised me. I hadn't thought about his workshop since childhood. The smell of oil and polished wood. The tiny screws scattered across his bench. The way he always smiled before saying, "Time isn't broken. We only lose our place inside it." The old man looked up. He was wise. I smiled faintly. He was patient with me. The clockmaker nodded as though he had known him. Perhaps, in this valley, that was possible. He finished repairing the watch and wound it carefully. It began ticking at once. Strong, steady. He placed it on a nearby shelf beside dozens of others. Only then did he ask, "What time did you arrive?" I opened my mouth to answer. The words refused to come. "Yesterday? Last week? A month ago?" I frowned. The answer seemed simple, yet it drifted farther away each time I reached for it. I checked my wristwatch. The date looked unfamiliar. Not wrong, just distant. "I don't remember." The clockmaker lowered his eyes. "Most people don't." A quiet sadness rested in his voice. "Does everyone forget?" "Only what they're ready to leave behind." His words lingered long after he stopped speaking. I walked slowly through the cabin once more. Near the back wall stood one empty shelf. A single nameplate rested upon it, blank, waiting. I didn't ask whose place it was. Somehow, I already feared the answer. As I turned to leave, the clockmaker handed me a small brass key. It fit easily into my palm. "You'll need this." "What does it open?" He smiled. "You haven't reached that door yet." Outside, the forest welcomed me with its familiar quiet. I slipped the key beside the old coin and the seashell in my pocket. 3 objects, 3 mysteries. The path carried me away from the cabin until the ticking of the countless clocks could no longer be heard. Only then did I realize something. I still couldn't remember the day I had first entered the village. No matter how hard I tried, there was only silence where that memory should have been. The brass key felt heavier than it should have. I turned it over my hand as dawn slowly reached across the valley. Beside it in my pocket rested the old coin and the seashell. 3 small objects, each impossible in its own way, each somehow connected to this place that refused to let me remember how I had arrived. I no longer searched for ordinary explanations. The village had quietly taken those from me. Morning passed gently. The streets were calm, the houses peaceful, and the people greeted one another with the same soft smiles I had seen since my first day. I smiled back without thinking. It surprised me how natural it felt. Near midday, I noticed several villagers carrying empty wooden chairs toward the edge of the forest. No one spoke. Each person carried only one chair. Curiosity drew me after them. The trail climbed to a wide clearing surrounded by tall pines. At its center lay a circle of smooth stones blackened by old ash, a bonfire, or at least the place where one should have been. A stack of carefully arranged logs stood inside the circle. Flames danced above them, bright, golden, beautiful. Yet as I stepped closer, I felt no warmth, not even the faintest touch. The fire burned without heat. The villagers placed their chairs around the circle and quietly took their seats. Someone motioned for me to do the same. An empty chair waited opposite the flames. It seemed to have been left there long before I arrived. I hesitated. Then I sat. The wood beneath me was comfortably warm from the afternoon sun. Above the fire, tiny flakes of ash floated upward into the pale sky. None fell. Each drifted higher until it disappeared among the branches overhead. The smoke carried an unusual scent. Not burning timber, not dry leaves. It reminded me of old letters stored for years inside a wooden box. Paper touched by countless hands. Words written with care. Memories folded away. I closed my eyes for a moment. The smell brought back an image of my mother tying bundles of family letters with faded ribbon before placing them carefully into the attic. She always said memories deserve gentle hands. When I opened my eyes again, the villagers had begun speaking. One by one, each told a simple story. An old man smiled as he described a fisherman who caught stars instead of fish. The others nodded as though they remembered him well. Then a young woman spoke about a teacher who collected songs from birds and wrote them into books. Soft laughter circled the fire. Another villager told of twin sisters who painted rainbows onto winter clouds. Every story felt warm, kind, completely impossible. No one questioned them. No one corrected a detail. It slowly became clear that none of these people had ever existed. And yet, everyone around the fire remembered them. The stories continued. Each name was spoken with quiet affection. Each life celebrated as though it had once belonged to the village. I listened carefully. Some part of me wanted to dismiss the tales as old legends. Instead, they felt strangely familiar, like dreams I had forgotten only moments after waking. The flames continued dancing, still without warmth. Hours seemed to pass. The light above the clearing slowly softened toward evening. At last, the priest stood. He looked around the circle before speaking. There is one place left. Every head turned toward the empty chair beside me. I looked at it. It had been empty all afternoon. Now, it wasn't. Someone sat there. Not a stranger. Not a villager. A man wearing my old hiking jacket. The same one I had lost years ago during a storm in another mountain range. His face remained hidden beneath the shadow of the firelight. He folded his hands calmly in his lap. No one else reacted. The villagers continued watching the flames, as though they had expected him all along. I tried to speak. Nothing came. Very slowly, the man turned toward me. I caught only the outline of his profile, enough to recognize it, enough to know it belonged to me, not as I looked now, as I had looked years before. Younger, lighter, before life had settled so many quiet thoughts behind my eyes. He smiled gently, not with sadness, with recognition. Then he stood, without a single sound. He walked around the fire. No footsteps disturbed the ash. He passed between the trees and disappeared into the forest. No one watched him leave. Only I did. The priest sat once more. The stories continued as though nothing unusual had happened. When darkness finally settled over the clearing, the fire remained bright. Its flames never weakened. Its warmth never came. The villagers rose together, one by one. They carried their chairs back toward the village. No one looked behind them. I was the last to leave. Before stepping onto the trail, I glanced back at the circle of stones. The fire still burned. Its ash continued rising toward the sky. The empty chair remained where it had been, waiting. I reached into my pocket and closed my fingers around the coin, the shell, and the brass key. For the first time since entering the valley, I understood something that frightened me more than any shadow or whispered voice. The village was no longer trying to convince me to stay. It had quietly begun making room for me. The next morning, I found the chair exactly where it had been. It stood beside the circle of stones as though no one had touched it after the gathering. Dew rested across the weathered wood, catching the first light of dawn in tiny silver drops. The strange fire was gone. Only a circle of pale ash remained. I stepped into the clearing. The ash was cold. When I brushed it gently with the toe of my boot, it scattered without leaving the slightest mark on the ground beneath it. It was as though the fire had never truly burned. I looked toward the forest. The figure I had watched disappear into the trees had left no trail. Neither had I. For a long while, I simply stood there listening. The mountains were waking. Birdsong drifted from somewhere high among the pines, and a cool breeze carried the fresh evergreen scent that always seemed strongest just after sunrise. It reminded me of family walks when I was a child. My father liked quiet trails. He would stop every so often, place one hand on the rough bark of a tree, and smile without saying why. Back then, I thought he was only resting. Now I wondered if he had simply known how to listen. The memory stayed with me as I returned to the village. After breakfast, I wandered without purpose until I reached the edge of the forest once more. Something had changed. Yesterday there had been only trees. Today, a narrow path stretched between them. I was certain it had not existed before. The ground was covered with soft pine needles, untouched except for a faint opening leading deeper into the woods. I looked behind me. The village remained quiet. No one seemed surprised. An old woman sweeping her porch noticed me. She smiled. "It's open. You can see it?" "I always could." "Why didn't you tell me?" "It wasn't yours yet." Her answer felt strangely familiar. So many things in this valley seemed to arrive only when they believed I was ready. I stepped onto the trail. The forest welcomed me with gentle silence. Tall pines leaned overhead, their branches forming a green ceiling that softened the morning light into quiet patches across the ground. The air smelled clean and cool, carrying the scent of fresh evergreen with every slow breath. I walked for several minutes. The path curved gently around moss-covered stones and fallen logs, always remaining just wide enough for one person. There were no crossroads, no signs, only the feeling that someone had walked this way many times before. Not long afterward, I noticed something unusual: the trees. At first, I thought it was only the breeze. Then I stopped. The branches nearest the trail shifted quietly aside, not bending in the wind, moving just enough to leave the narrow path clear. As I continued walking, each tree seemed to make the same small gesture, almost like a polite bow. I smiled despite myself. The sight should have frightened me. Instead, it felt strangely welcoming. The deeper I walked, the more familiar everything became. A cluster of white flowers beside an old stump, A crooked pine split by lightning many years ago. A smooth stone shaped almost like a heart. I had never seen these things before, yet I somehow knew they belonged here. A quiet certainty settled inside me. Then a memory surfaced. Not complete, only a fragment. I was younger, much younger, standing beneath towering trees while distant lights flickered ahead. Someone was holding my hand. I couldn't see their face, only their sleeve, dark green. The memory vanished before I could reach it. I stopped walking. My hand drifted into my pocket. The old coin, the seashell, the brass key, all three remained exactly where they belonged. I continued onward. The trail climbed gently until the forest began to thin. Sunlight reached farther between the trunks. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt expectant. At the top of the ridge, I turned around. The path behind me stretched peacefully through the pines. Something caught my eye. The ground. I frowned. Soft pine needles covered every step of the trail. There should have been footprints. Mine. There were none. I walked back several paces. Still nothing. I pressed my boot firmly into the earth. The needles shifted. When I lifted my foot, the ground looked untouched. A slow breath escaped me. I remembered my first day in the village. The empty roads. The missing footprints. Perhaps they had never truly been missing. Perhaps this place simply refused to keep them. I looked toward the village one last time. The rooftops were barely visible through the trees now. They seemed farther away than they should have been. Not because I had walked so far, because something inside me had quietly stopped measuring distance in miles. For the first time since arriving, I no longer felt the urge to search for the road home. The thought surprised me. I expected fear. Instead, I felt only a quiet calm. The forest had opened its path. The mountains had stopped feeling unfamiliar. Even the silence seemed less lonely than before. I stood there for a long while, breathing the cool evergreen air. Then I turned toward the trail again. This time, I never looked back. The forest did not seem eager to let me leave. When I followed the trail back toward the village, it felt shorter than before, as though the trees had quietly folded the distance behind me. By the time the first rooftops appeared through the branches, the afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, filling the valley with soft golden light. Everything looked familiar, more familiar than it should have. I noticed little things I could not remember learning. Which gate creaked, which chimney leaned slightly to one side, which porch always held a rocking chair facing the mountains. It was as though the village had stopped introducing itself. It expected me to remember. The old brass key rested in my pocket beside the coin and the seashell. Without thinking, I wrapped my fingers around it. The metal grew warm. At that very moment, I knew where I needed to go. Not because someone had told me, because the feeling arrived as naturally as remembering the way to a childhood home. A narrow lane led toward the edge of the village. Hidden behind climbing ivy stood a small house I was certain I had never visited. Yet my feet carried me there without hesitation. The gate opened with a gentle push. The garden had long been claimed by wild grass, but neat rows of faded flowers still bordered the stone path. Their colors had almost disappeared with time, leaving only quiet hints of blue and yellow beneath the afternoon light. The front door stood closed. An old brass lock waited beneath the handle. My hand slipped into my pocket before I could think. The key fit perfectly. A soft click echoed through the empty house. The door opened inward. Warm air greeted me. Not warm from sunlight, warm with familiarity. The scent of faded wallpaper and old tea drifted gently through the hallway. I stopped breathing for a moment. My grandmother's sitting room had carried that very smell. She always brewed tea before anyone arrived, even when she wasn't expecting visitors. The memory settled softly inside me. I've been here. The words escaped before I realized I had spoken them. No one answered. Dust floated lazily through thin beams of afternoon light. A coat rested on a wooden hook beside the entrance. A pair of well-worn boots stood neatly below it, waiting for someone who had stepped out only moments ago. The silence wasn't empty. It was patient. I wandered into the sitting room. A fireplace occupied one wall. Books filled a low shelf beneath the windows. Framed photographs covered the mantel. I stepped closer. The first photograph showed a family standing outside the house. A man, a woman, two children. Their faces were gentle, though I didn't recognize any of them. I moved to the next frame. The same family, only older. The children had grown taller. The third photograph caught my attention. There were 5 people now. I blinked. I was standing among them, not as I looked today. Younger, perhaps 10 years old. One hand rested on the shoulder of the older man. Everyone smiled naturally, as though the picture had been taken after years of living together. My heart pounded quietly. I picked up the frame. The photograph felt real. The paper had yellowed with age. There were no signs that anyone had altered it. I searched every face again. None seemed surprised that I belonged there. I set it down carefully. No. The word barely reached the room. Another frame waited beside it. I looked. The picture had changed. It was the same family, the same house. But now I stood closer to the center. One arm rested comfortably around the woman's shoulders, as though I had always been part of them. I looked back at the first photograph. It had changed too. I was there now as well, standing beside the youngest child, smiling. A quiet understanding settled over me. The house wasn't changing to include me. It was remembering me. A floorboard creaked upstairs. I looked toward the ceiling. The sound came again, slow, gentle, not threatening, more like someone moving carefully so as not to wake another person. I climbed the staircase. Each step felt strangely familiar beneath my feet. Halfway up, I realized something unsettling. I already knew what waited at the top. A narrow hallway, a small bedroom to the left, a study to the right. When I reached the landing, that was exactly what I found. The bedroom door stood open. Inside rested a neatly made bed beneath a patchwork quilt stitched from faded pieces of cloth. On the bedside table stood a small wooden toy bird. I smiled without thinking. I knew how its wings moved. I picked it up, one gentle twist of its tail, and the wings lifted, exactly as I expected. I frowned. How? No answer came. Only another quiet memory. A child's laughter. A rainy afternoon. Hands placing the little bird beside the bed before sleep. The memory faded as quickly as it had arrived. I returned downstairs. The photographs waited silently. One last frame rested alone near the window. I hadn't noticed it before. There was only one person in this picture. Me, standing on the porch, older than before, almost exactly as I look now. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't afraid. I simply looked. Home. Outside, the evening light began to soften. I placed the photograph back where it belonged. For the first time since entering the village, I didn't ask myself how any of this was possible. I no longer searched for explanations. As I stepped outside and quietly locked the door behind me, I slipped the brass key back into my pocket. It felt lighter now, as though it had finally opened the place that had been waiting for all along. Morning arrived beneath the sky, so clear that the mountains looked almost close enough to touch. The air carried the cool freshness that comes just before autumn gives way to winter. Frost rested lightly on the grass outside the guest house, sparkling whenever the first sunlight reached it. I stood for a while on the porch, breathing slowly, listening to the village wake around me. Somewhere nearby, a kettle began to whistle. A dog barked once. Then everything became quiet again. I realized I no longer counted the quiet as something unusual. It had become part of the place. Perhaps part of me. The old coin, the seashell, and the brass key rested comfortably in my pocket. I carried them everywhere now without thinking. They felt less like objects I had found, and more like things I had finally remembered to keep. After breakfast, my feet carried me toward the western hills. I wasn't searching for anything. Still, I had the strange feeling that someone was waiting. The trail grew narrower until it reached an open valley unlike any I had seen before. There was no river, only a long stretch of smooth gray earth running between two grassy slopes. The valley should have felt empty. Instead, it felt as though water had only recently slipped away. The smell of weathered rope drifted gently through the cool air, mixed with the scent of old timber warmed by the morning sun. I followed it. At the center of the valley stood a small wooden dock. It reached several yards into nothing. No lake, no river, no sea, just open ground. Tied beside the dock rested a narrow ferry. Its weathered planks bore the marks of countless journeys. Thick ropes secured it to a worn wooden post that had been polished smooth by years of careful hands. An old man sat quietly inside the boat. He wore a faded coat and a broad hat that shaded most of his face. Without looking up, he spoke. "I've been expecting you." His voice carried the calm certainty I had come to recognize in the village. "I don't see any water," I said. "You don't need to." He smiled. "The boat remembers." I stepped closer. The ferry rested perfectly level, as though floating upon a river only it could feel. The old man stood and untied the rope. "Will you cross?" I looked around the valley. There was nowhere else to go. "I suppose I will." He offered his hand as I stepped aboard. The wood beneath my boots shifted gently, not with movement, with memory. The ferryman pushed lightly against the dock with a long pole. The boat drifted away, across empty ground. There was no scraping, no resistance, only the quiet feeling of gliding over perfectly calm water. I sat near the bow. The valley slipped past in complete silence. A cool breeze brushed my face, carrying the faint scent of water that could not possibly be there. Without thinking, I leaned over the side. For the briefest moment, I saw ripples. They vanished before I could be certain. The ferryman watched the unseen horizon. Most people looked down. What do they see? What they left behind? I considered asking another question. Instead, I looked ahead. The crossing felt impossibly short. No sooner had we left the dock than another appeared before us. The ferryman guided the boat alongside it with practiced ease. "We're here." I frowned. "Already?" He nodded. "It only takes as long as you're willing to hold on." I stepped ashore. The ground felt exactly the same. The air felt exactly the same. Nothing appeared different. I turned to thank him. The old man handed me a small length of weathered rope. Its fibers were smooth from years of use. "You won't need it." "Then why give it to me?" "So you remember crossing." I accepted it. When I looked back toward the valley, my breath caught. The village was gone. No rooftops, no church, no market, no guest house. Only endless hills stretching beneath the pale afternoon sky. I spun slowly. The dock behind me remained. The ferry rocked gently. But the valley I had crossed now looked impossibly wide, as though many miles separated the two shores. The ferryman watched me quietly. Where did the village go? He adjusted the brim of his hat. "It hasn't gone anywhere. I can't see it." "No." He smiled kindly. "You can't." A quiet sadness touched his face. "It becomes difficult after crossing." I looked toward the empty distance where I knew the village should have been. No matter how carefully I searched, I found nothing. Only rolling hills beneath the open sky. I reached into my pocket. The coin, the shell, the key, now the rope, for small reminders that something waited beyond what I could see. I turned back to the ferryman. "I may need to return." His eyes held a warmth that reminded me of my grandfather. "If you're meant to." Before I could answer, he climbed back into the ferry. The rope securing the boat loosened by itself. The vessel drifted quietly away from the dock. Halfway across the empty valley, it began to fade. Not quickly, not like mist disappearing. More like a memory becoming gentle around its edges. Soon only the old man's outline remained. Then, nothing. I stood alone beside the silent dock for a long time. The wind carried no answers. Only the faint scent of old timber lingering in the afternoon air. For the first time since entering the hidden village, I realized I was no longer trying to find my way back. I was simply waiting for the path to remember me again. The valley waited beneath a pale sky that never seemed to brighten. It was early morning in late autumn. The grass carried tiny beads of dew that shivered against my boots, and every roof glistened as though dawn had only just arrived. Yet nothing warmed. Not the old wood, not the stone paths, not the quiet faces moving from house to house. I watched from the porch where I had spent another night without dreams. Someone carried a basket of bread. Another folded white cloth across a long table. The smell of fresh baking drifted through the cold, mixing with crushed herbs that reminded me of the small garden my grandmother once kept behind her house. For a moment, I almost remember the road that had taken me there as a child. The memory slipped away before I could hold it. No one hurried. No one whispered. Every movement felt practiced, as though this morning had happened many times before. Children brushed tiny drops from wooden fences. Older hands polished simple cups until they reflected the faint glow above. A bird crossed the valley. Its wings made no sound. Only the gentle rustling of nearby leaves answered before everything settled again. I had asked before who they were waiting for. No one had replied. They had only smiled with quiet kindness, the sort that made questions seem unnecessary. This morning, I stopped asking, because somewhere inside me, I already knew. The feeling arrived before the memory did. It rested inside my chest like an old letter finally opened. I stepped into the narrow lane between the cottages. The stones beneath my feet were cool, their smooth edges damp beneath my fingertips as I steadied myself against a low wall. Each doorway stood open. Each window faced the same distant hill. The valley held its breath without feeling empty. A woman passed me carrying flowers tied with thin string, their sweet scent mixed with the clean smell of water flowing somewhere beyond the trees. She looked at me only once. Then she smiled, not with surprise, with recognition. Others did the same. An old man lowered his head. A young boy offered the smallest wave. No one stared. No one questioned why I had joined them. It felt as though they had expected me to understand all along. I looked toward the narrow path leading between the hills. That was where every pair of eyes rested, waiting, not with fear, with welcome. Then I saw the figure, far away, walking at an easy pace. The distance hid every feature, yet something inside me recognized the shape before my eyes truly did. A familiar walk, a familiar way of holding one shoulder slightly lower than the other. The same habit I remembered from another life, before the forest, before the lights, before this place gathered around me like a forgotten dream. My own smile appeared without permission, soft, natural. No one reacted. It was as if that smile completed something everyone else had already seen. The figure came closer, closer enough that memory finally reached me. Not all at once, only in careful pieces. The distant lights between the trees, my own footsteps following them without fear. The strange comfort that had pulled me deeper instead of warning me away. No one had forced me. No voice had called my name. I had crossed because I wanted to know what waited beyond the darkness. The answer had been this valley. The answer had always been this valley. As the traveler entered the village, every face relaxed. There was no celebration, only relief. Another person had found the place hidden beyond ordinary mornings. Another name was beginning to fade somewhere beyond these hills. I wondered who would notice first. A friend, a neighbor, someone passing an empty chair. Then another thought arrived. Would anyone notice at all? The question no longer frightened me. I turned toward the forest where I had first arrived. The trees stood close together, their trunks dark against the endless morning. For the first time, I understood why no map had ever shown this place. Maps belonged to people who remembered. This valley belonged to those who had already been released. The clean morning air filled my lungs. It carried no smoke from distant towns, no smell of rain on busy streets, no trace of places I once believed I loved. Only quiet earth, fresh leaves, cold water. Everything else had become difficult to picture. Even my own childhood home seemed unfinished around the edges. I searched for my mother's face. It faded before I could see her eyes. I tried to remember the sound of my own name spoken aloud. Nothing came, only calm. The keeper waited beneath the oldest tree, not towering, not frightening. Its shape shifted gently like branches moving beneath deep water. Ancient eyes rested on me with endless patience, holding neither judgment nor hunger. I finally understood. It had never hunted anyone. It gathered those who stepped beyond the boundary on their own. Those carrying pieces of themselves the world had already begun to lose, not to punish, to preserve. Here, forgotten souls would never disappear completely. Outside, memories weakened until nothing remained. Inside, they rested together beneath an endless morning. I looked back one final time. The path behind me had already begun to vanish beneath moss and fallen branches. The forest closed with quiet certainty, not trapping me, protecting what lay beyond. Somewhere outside these trees, people would continue living. Conversations would change. Photographs would lose meaning. My name would leave every mouth without anyone noticing its absence. The thought settled inside me like warm hands wrapped around cold fingers. I found that I no longer wished to leave. The valley welcomed another ordinary morning that would never become afternoon. The villagers returned to their peaceful work. I walked beside them without counting the days. When I glanced once more toward the place where the forest had been, there was only silence. It was the first morning I understood there would never be another sunrise. The hidden valley rested beneath the same quiet sky, washed in pale light that never grew stronger. It was early winter now. Thin frost covered the garden fences, and every blade of grass carried tiny crystals that sparkled without melting. The cold touched my fingertips as I opened the cottage door. From somewhere nearby came the gentle splash of water filling wooden buckets. The smell of fresh pine drifted through the village, clean and sharp, carrying none of the smoke or dust I once believed belonged to every morning. I stood there longer than I meant to. Years ago, before I wandered into the forest, I could never begin a day without rubbing sleep from my eyes and searching for the first warmth from the rising sun. Now I search for neither. My hands remain calm at my sides. No one asked where I was going. The villagers moved through familiar paths with quiet purpose, their baskets filled with bread, dried fruit, and folded cloth. Every face carried peaceful certainty. Not happiness, not sadness, only acceptance. The sound of distant water flowing over smooth stones blended with quiet breathing as people passed one another without needing many words. I walked toward the edge of the valley where the trees stood together like old friends. The narrow trail I had once followed was gone. Not hidden, gone. Young roots crossed the ground where footsteps had once been possible. Small green plants covered every space between them. Even if someone searched with perfect care, they would never find an opening there again. That was when I finally understood. No map had failed because people were careless. No traveler had simply missed the valley. The village did not belong to the world anymore. It waited outside memory itself. Only those already drifting beyond remembrance could ever reach it. A slow breeze passed through the branches. Its cool touch carried the scent of clean morning air so pure that every other smell I had once known faded from my thoughts. I tried to remember rain falling across city streets. Nothing came. I searched for the smell of old books stacked beside my bed. Only emptiness answered. Even the taste of my favorite tea had become impossible to picture. The valley was gently replacing every familiar piece of the life I had left behind. Not by force, by kindness, as though painful memories were heavy stones being lifted from tired hands. I followed the oldest path until I reached the great tree standing above the village. Its bark stretched wider than any house. Fine lines covered its trunk like countless forgotten names carved by invisible hands. The keeper waited beneath its branches. It did not resemble the monster I had feared during my first nights here. Its shape flowed quietly between bark, moss, and soft light. Ancient eyes watched the valley with endless care. Looking at it no longer filled me with fear, only understanding. People had called it a demon because they needed a word for what they could not explain. But demons destroyed, this being preserved. It gathered those who had slipped through cracks of memory before the world erased them completely. Not prisoners, not victims. Souls the world had quietly stopped carrying. Its task had lasted longer than kingdoms, longer than roads, longer than names themselves. I lowered my head without thinking, not because I had been told to, because gratitude felt natural. The keeper returned the gesture. Nothing more. Nothing was needed. The silence between us held more meaning than conversation ever could. As I walked back toward the cottages, another memory reached for me, the distant lights. I had blamed them for leading me away from safety. I had imagined they belonged to something hunting lonely travelers. Now I saw the truth. The lights had only shown a path. I had chosen every step after that. Curiosity had carried me across the unseen boundary. No spell had touched my mind. No hidden voice had called my name. Some quiet part of my heart had already been searching for this place before I knew it existed. The realization settled gently inside me. There was nothing left to regret. Children laughed softly while arranging winter flowers beside the meeting hall. Their small hands brushed against cold petals, and the flowers released a faint, earthy fragrance. Older villagers prepared warm soup over slow fires. Steam rose into the endless morning before fading into the bright sky that never changed. I recognized every face now, not from another life. From this one, this had become home so gradually that I had never noticed the moment it happened. I searched once more for my own name. It rested just beyond reach, a shape without sound, a memory without letters. Somewhere beyond the forest, people who had once spoken it were already forgetting. Old photographs would become difficult to explain. Stories would lose a familiar character. An empty place at a table would feel ordinary after enough time. The thought should have broken my heart. Instead, it brought peace. The world outside would continue without me. The valley would continue with me. Neither future felt wrong. I walked toward the forest one final time. The trees stood close together, their branches woven into a wall no traveler would ever cross by accident. There was no path waiting beyond them now. Only leaves, roots, and endless green. The boundary had closed because my journey had ended. I rested one hand against the nearest trunk. Its rough surface felt warm despite the winter air. I thanked the forest without speaking. Then I turned away. I did not look back again.